The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 476. Huge Fleet. On the other side of the sea, Lieutenant General Raven Hobbuck, commander of the British fleet, was driven crazy by Friedrich because the Austrian fleet had anchored again. This time the Austrians dispatched an unprecedentedly large fleet. There were 3 superclass battleships alone, not to mention the total number of other types of battleships reaching 12. Coupled with various types of warships and transport ships, the number of personnel alone exceeded 27,000 people. This makes the team of 20 people and 7 warships sent by the British look a bit small. Billy Mullen Jr., the head of the British investigation team, felt the pressure doubled. He even suspected that the Austrians had premeditated a war with themselves. It is strange to say that a Dutch merchant ship was attacked by British pirates in the Southeast Asia. As a result, Austria and Britain were responsible for investigating the ins and outs of this incident. In order to frighten the opponent, the Royal Navy directly dispatched a fleet of 7 new paddle wheel warships. As a result, the latter dispatched a larger fleet. Of course, this was not what Franz had ordered, but it doesn't mean that he was shocked. When he learned the news, he took an 18-hour train ride to Trieste and spent the night looking for his uncle, a naval marshal. Uncle Friedrich, what are you doing? Give the British a show of strength. We sent 10 people here, but they actually sent 20 people. There are also 7 battleships. Investigate pirates. It's better to go to Nanyang to grab territory. Friedrich obviously had a big opinion against the British, and he had long known about Franz's plans in the Southeast Asia region. Of course, he also knew that the whole thing was inevitable, but even if you want to retaliate against your opponent, this fleet is too big and a bit wasteful. And why do you want to bring so many armies? A large part of the reason why Franz came to see Friedrich was that the former saw a large number of army officers in the entourage list, and then he also found a large number of army soldiers, and even engineering teams and medical soldiers. Franz, there are some things I have to tell you. It was obviously you, the colonial minister, who said that tooth for tooth, blood for blood, in some of the attacks on Austrian colonists and soldiers in West Africa last year. Tribes hid in the forests and hung the remains of their victims. Their eaten skeletons from trees on the surface. It was a defensive move by the natives to intimidate outsiders for their own safety, but in fact it was a revenge move by the French and Portuguese against the Austrians. After all, the arrival of Franz and his party affected their interests, so the operators hiding behind the scenes decided to bribe some tribes. However, most of the local tribes did not dare to accept this kind of business. In view of the exaggerated combat power displayed by the Austrian army before. So the French and Portuguese sent explorers to find the primitive tribe deep in the forest. These terrible guys had no fear of the Rauchi army. They only recognized 3 things: muskets, food and women. After some investigation after the incident happened, Franz already understood the ins and outs of the incident, but the solution still had to be solved. Because the West African region occupied by Austria is different from Algeria and Morocco occupied by France. Most of the so-called countries are still in the era of primitive civilization, and they are not even medieval countries. Let's not talk about whether they can conquer it. Communication is also a problem. Franz must communicate with them in a way they can understand, otherwise he will get half the result with twice the effort. So he made a plan to eliminate the 27 tribes. The process was the same as before. The Austrians would defeat them, and then the other tribes would divide their children and property. Franz only wanted the land. However, it was still the rainy season in West Africa at that time. For the modern Austrian army, it was still necessary to avoid going to the tropical rainforest to fight with primitive people. But just after the rainy season, troubles continued on the European continent, and it was not until recently that Austria got around to it. Just end the fight before the rainy season, in May. In fact, in addition to the army, there were also a large number of colonists and professional technical workers who went to West Africa, mainly skilled farmers and breeders. Of course, there were also some explorers and geologists. After all, Europeans' understanding of the interior of Africa was still very limited at this time, especially in terms of geology. In the 15th century, an explorer saw Africans exchanging animal skins with Europeans. Iron tools. We came to the conclusion that there is no iron in Africa. This outrageous rumor was still believed to be true by Europeans until the early 20th century. In addition, there are also many reserves of various precious metals and rare metals in Africa, but they have not been discovered yet. Of course, the fastest way to withdraw funds in Africa is still the planting industry. This is because Austria needs a large number of laborers, and it is unrealistic to expect to transfer people from the country. Therefore, Franz needed to turn those tribal chiefs into planters. Only by integrating them into Austria's economic system could the local area maintain long-term stability. Okay, Uncle Friedrich, no matter which general leads the army this time, I still have my original request. Only defeat and not pursue, and set the mountain on fire. This is the driest season in West Africa, and fire attack is undoubtedly a good choice. It saves time and effort, and the burned land will leave a large amount of humus that can be used for farming. As for destroying the environment, Franz can't think that much now, and he's not native, so what's the worst he can do to adopt a rotating farming system? The reason for only defeating and not pursuing is very simple. Africa is a place where people are not familiar with. If the Austrian army really pursues it, it may expand the results or fall into a trap. As for annihilating the remnants of the hostile tribes, other local tribes can do it for them. Of course, if there are any traps, they will step on them for the Austrian side. As for those rebellious tribes, they will soon discover that once they show weakness, they are seeking death, because they will be torn apart by their compatriots around them, so they can only choose to fight with their last ditch. However, Franz still likes the numerical value game. After all, the technology and organization of the two are several generations behind, and there is no possibility of losing in a head-to-head confrontation. Friedrich seemed a little dissatisfied with Franz's approach, which forced the latter to remind the former again. Uncle Friedrich, you don't want to become Austria's eternal sinner, right? After some discussion between the two, Friedrich had to accept Franz's suggestion of sending war supervisors and prosecutors. In fact, Franz hoped to send some of his right-hand assistants, but the reality was that he did not. Yes, Franz did have a lot of experts and scholars on his hands, and there were also countless soldiers who were willing to make friends with him. But Franz could know which scholars and experts had real materials through the history of later generations, but he could not distinguish the advantages and disadvantages of these soldiers. After all, most of the last batch of famous generals in Austrian history were already famous at this time, and Archduke Albrecht, who was not famous, was not lacking in fame at all. But if those veterans were really sent to Africa, they would probably die of illness before the war started. In the same way, the last few famous generals sent to Africa have a high chance of dying. Moreover, most of these people are of noble origin, and do not need any military exploits to occupy their future positions. As for these war supervisors and prosecutors, they are actually all outstanding graduates within the empire. Of course, the excellence of these people is not given by their mentors, but obtained by taking Franz's examination. But those exams can't actually prove anything. What can prove them is the battlefield and practice. Chapter 477 ending additional update. On the island of Kalimantan, Hugao finally arrived at Malaport after several days of frightening march. The reason for this is entirely due to the landmines and landslides that appear from time to time. The rainy season has made the road that was once destroyed by the Nanming army become even muddy. But what depressed Hugao the most was that along the way, he didn't see even a single hair of the Nanming army, and even the indigenous people disappeared. The gunfire that rang out from time to time at night was just the fighting between Indians and British soldiers. He even suspected that the Nanming army had given up pursuing him. But the smoke rising from the mountains from time to time told him that the god of death had never left Maraport, a port that has experienced 2 wars, has become deserted. Not even a body is left, and only the wreckage of a few warships are still standing next to the dock. The huge battleship was blown into 2 pieces. This scene shocked Hugao. Even the coastal defense guns of Portsmouth Fortress could not have such power directly blow the battleship into two pieces, unless it directly hits the ammunition depot, causing a chain explosion point. But the wreckage of the 4 battleships on the shore were all the same, as if a giant ocean beast had torn them apart from the middle. He even thought of the Eastern super weapons described in Marco Polo's Travels point. The soldiers checked around the airport and found no survivors, nor any trace of the Nanming people. Of course, there was not a grain of food, and even the wood for the fire was taken away. This made Hu Gao feel extremely tired. His supplies could last for a while, but how to leave? Do he have to build his own ship? Maybe you should choose to surrender, but you can be shameless. Can the British Empire be shameless? What's more, he still has 2,500 soldiers under his command, as well as sufficient ammunition and food point. But the biggest problems and confusions facing us now are houses and firewood, and how the Nanming army defeated the garrison stationed in Mariport before. Hu Gao once inspected the outer city wall. Only the city gate was damaged, and the surrounding fighting was not fierce. Instead, there were traces of fighting everywhere in the city. Most of the houses were burned down, and there were even more damage around the pier crater. He could be sure that the enemy did not come from the sea, nor did they rush in from outside the city wall. Then there was only one possibility, to suddenly appear from the city point, but this was too strange, because at that time the British troops almost killed all the local aboriginal males for safety reasons. But if these aborigines hadn't rebelled, how could we explain the fact that a large number of enemy troops suddenly appeared in the city? Hu Gao suddenly thought of something, and immediately ordered the soldiers to rotate in 3 shifts and be on alert 24 hours a day. He believed that the eerie calm now was the calm before the storm. It's just that 7 days have passed, and Nanming's troops still haven't caught a single shadow. Of course, Hu Gao's army was not idle either. They had repaired the previously damaged walls and houses, also found some food hidden underground, and used some grease to make a fire, to obtain a batch of dry firewood that could be used. Hu Gao even felt that he was about to become the protagonist in Robinson Crusoe. Maybe he could really build a ship and lead his men away from here. But there are also some strange things that make him feel weird. That is, not a single merchant ship has passed here these days. Even if Mariport is not a big port, it shouldn't be so deserted. At this time, the messenger's report interrupted his thinking. The rain has stopped. Very good. Hu Gao walked out of the room and looked at the sea that was reborn after the rain. He seemed to see the shadow of the sailboat, which made him very excited. Bring me the binoculars. The adjutant on the side quickly took out the telescope from the suitcase and handed it to the general. Hu Gao raised his telescope, and he really saw a fleet, and it was a British fleet flying the Union Jack and the St. George's flag. He shouted excitedly, but he could not restore his own low morale. After all, many soldiers died of hypothermia, freezing and starvation due to long-term mental stress. Many people were still immersed in sadness and could not feel the general's excitement. It's our fleet, the British Empire's fleet, is coming to pick us up. We are going home. At this time, some people raised their heads and looked into the distance, and then some people ran towards the shore. 1 or 2 people shouted excitedly. They were finally leaving this hell that was sometimes extremely hot and sometimes extremely cold. As the sun slowly rose, the fleet also approached the coast, like a coquettish beauty. The ships of the fleet did not land directly to reward these brave men, but lined up in a line from a distance. The eagerly awaited British soldiers on the dock didn't know what was happening before them. They thought it was a performance. But Hu Gao, who had experienced many battles, immediately realized that something was wrong. He picked up the telescope and saw a desperate scene. The gun doors of more than a dozen military ships opened one after another, and then the black muzzles were revealed. But even at this time, Hu Gao still held a trace of luck in his heart. Maybe this was a salute to comfort the warriors. But as the cannon sounded, green smoke came out of the muzzles of each cannon, and large iron balls covered the sky and hit the shore. A few seconds later, the railway set off flowers of flesh and blood in the crowd. The power of naval guns was far more powerful than the common field guns of the army. And there are many tricks, such as incendiary bombs and explosive bombs. After crushing several British soldiers, a shell rolled in front of the last British soldier. Just when the latter thought he could escape, The iron bullet exploded, and the huge airwave lifted it into the air 5 meters high, and then fell heavily. Enemy. Attack. This is not our ship, this is Nanming's ship. Fight back quickly. Who? Gao shouted and directed calmly. Quickly. Retreat into the fortress. The enemy must want to attack us from both sides. He guessed correctly. At this time, a large number of Nanming troops appeared from all directions outside the city point. With the poor strength of our own troops at this time, it is impossible to deal with the siege from all directions at the same time. Then he could only retreat into the fortress, built on the mountain, so that he only had to deal with the Nanming army attacking from the front, and in terms of firepower, he did not think that the Nanming army could break through the fortress's defense point. It's just that Hu Gao missed one thing, that is, the earthen artillery of the Nanming army was naturally unable to do it. But the naval guns on British warships can. These large caliber naval guns are stronger in range and power than the field guns brought by Hu Gao. Under the bombardment of large caliber naval guns, the British troops hiding in the fortress became turtles in the urn. The devastating bombardment made the British army desperate. Every explosion of a shell would cause the ground to shake. Seeing his brave soldiers walking around like headless flies, he couldn't help but feel heartbroken. Fight back. Fight back quickly. You damn assassin, you low-class person. Hu Gao grabbed an Indian gunner by the collar and roared. The Indian gunner said with a frustrated look, "General, our cannons can't reach them." Chapter 478 Beat. Royal Greenhouse. Franz hasn't been here for a long time. He looked at the round carrot in his hand and felt a strong sense of disobedience. This thing is the famous beet, but it is far from the size that Franz saw in later generations. It is only about 1/5 of the size of northeastern beets in later generations. But in fact, what the protagonist sees in later generations are all beets that are displayed for people to appreciate. Most of them weigh more than 5 kilograms, and the big ones can even weigh about 10 kilograms. But in fact, the average weight of normal beets is about 1 kilogram to 1.5 kilograms. Sugar beet production is actually a waste, although 30% of the world's sugar production comes from this crop. Some people will tell you that beets make up half of the sugar industry. But what they won't actually say is that sugar beets account for 48% of the world's total sugar crop area. In terms of sugar yield, sugar beets are inferior to sugar cane. Moreover, as far as the 19th century is concerned, the sugar production process of beets is completely different from the cane sugar process that has a history of thousands of years and seems extremely immature. After all, this is only a new thing that emerged in 1800. Moreover, the sugar content of sugar beets that have not been genetically modified is alarmingly low, and the unit yield is unsatisfactory. However, this crop has attracted the attention of European countries as soon as it appeared. There is nothing that can be done about it. Europe, which is located in the temperate and subarctic zones, cannot grow sugar cane. In Europe, sugar used to be a treasure that could only be eaten by the upper class and would only be taken out when important guests came to visit. The vast majority of people in Europe could not afford and had no access to sugar. This situation did not change until the age of discovery. The Europeans planted a large number of sugar crops in the Americas and then transported a large amount of sugar back. In order to increase the sugar crops, they set out from Europe to Africa and used the cheap goods they produced in exchange for a large number of black slaves to be sent to the Americas. This is the notorious triangular trade point, but Europeans were still very prescient in some aspects. Starting from 1800, almost all major European countries began to cultivate sugar beet. Even though France has experienced war and two regime changes, it has never stopped supporting the sugar beet industry. This increased the number of sugar refineries in France from 1 to 61 in 1844. The German region and the Russians were not to be outdone. The area of sugar beet cultivated land increased dozens of times. Such a big fanfare, but Franz felt that it was not enough. Take Prussia as an example. At this time, Prussia had a population of 16 million, but its sugar output was only 1,500 tons, averaging only 0.1 kilograms per person. At this time, Prussia's per capita annual sugar consumption was 2.5 kilograms, which meant that their self-sufficiency rate was only 4% at this time. The per capita annual sugar consumption in France was 5 kilograms, while in the UK it was an outrageous 10 kilograms historically. Austria had only a pitiful 0.8 kilograms, which was only stronger than the 0.5 kilograms of Italian states and Spain. However, at this time, the per capita annual sugar consumption in the Austrian Empire reached 4 kilograms, 5 times the historical level point. This is mainly due to the ally of Mexico. Historically, this was a major sugar producing country in this era. However, due to the impact of the US-Mexican War, its status was not guaranteed, but it still accounted for 9% of the world's sugar production. Historically, the world's total sugar production in 1844 was 1 million tons, and Mexico's sugar production was 90,000 tons. However, Mexico has not lost much land now, and the political situation is relatively stable. Coupled with the leadership of the Mexico Development Company, Mexico's sugar production has increased to 150,000 tons, accounting for 14% of the world's sugar production point, and 80% of this sugar was used by Tanzania to pay off debts and exchange for supplies. Naturally, Austria getting so much sugar can allow its citizens to enjoy low price and high quality white sugar, of course. In addition to other Central American colonies and West African colonies, most of the cane sugar was shipped back to Austria, and this was the beginning of the sweet party in Vienna point. But the days of sucking blood from the colonies would come to an end sooner or later, and at this time it was because Franz firmly controlled the source of sugar that he was able to suppress prices. But if the beet sugar industry had not developed, Austria would not have been able to compete with cheap overseas sugar at that time. If Austrians still want to eat cheap sugar, the lack of guarantees will trigger a sugar war. Sugar has many uses. In addition to being a food, it is also a strategic material point. Yes, this is a strategic material, because sugar can be used to make alcohol, which is used in industry, and for medical disinfection. At the same time, sugar was also the earliest placebo. It could soothe the injured hearts of soldiers and boost their morale point. This is an important part of the capitalist military theory of later generations. The side with more materials will definitely win. Point. Sugar can not only be used in war indirectly, but can also be used directly in war. Yes, this stuff can actually increase the power of explosives. As long as it is mixed in a certain proportion, it can even be used as a propellant. Point. Therefore, if Austria wants to become a real power, sugar is also one of the essential raw materials. But what gives Franz a headache is that he has not developed any good new varieties after several years of breeding. At the same time, the beet sugar production technology is also very backward. 18 tons of beets can only produce 1 ton of sugar. Modern technology only requires 8 tons of sugar beets to squeeze out 1 ton of sugar. But at this time, sugarcane sugar production technology can already achieve the effect of 1 ton of sugar from 10 tons of sugar cane. Point. This made him feel that his future was a bit bleak. In fact, sugar can be stored for a very long time, even up to 10 years. Franz might choose to reserve enough sugar in advance to meet the war's consumption, which would free up more arable land to grow food. Point. But he quickly rejected this idea. After all, beet sugar production was not only for fighting wars, but also to control prices and regulate demand. Point. Franz knew that he still had a long way to go, and he couldn't just focus on the present, let alone ignore the present. Point. Moreover, it is impossible for Franz to directly give up cheap overseas cane sugar and directly support the domestic sugar beet industry. Point. But he can create some illusions and rumors, such as beet sugar is healthier and more suitable for consumption than cane sugar. At the same time, beet sugar was purchased in large quantities when manufacturing weapons and developing industry. The reason was naturally that beet sugar was purer. As for how pure and how healthy it was, people at the time could only rely on their imagination. Point. Unlike sugar cane, this plant expands very quickly and requires little care as long as the temperature and soil are right. Point. As for the variety and technical issues that Franz is worried about, they are actually not a problem. Before the advent of microscopic genetic improvement technology, there was not much room for improvement in sugar content among beet varieties. Even if genetic improvement technology is used, it only shortens the growth cycle of sugar beets and has little impact on the sugar yield. Point. As for technical issues, historically, beet sugar production technology would advance rapidly in 1850. and the material to sugar ratio were dropped directly from 18:1 to 11:1. Therefore, Franz's entanglement is not of great significance. Of course, if you study it in advance, you can indeed make a wave of quick money. And due to the promotion of chemical fertilizers, agricultural machinery, and scientific farming methods, Austria's sugar beet yield per acre is much higher than that of other European countries. However, the total amount of beet sugar produced each year is only 7,000 tons, which is still a huge gap compared to France's 30,000 tons. Franz's plan is to double Austria's total beet sugar production within 4 years. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 479, Feeling Conscience. When Franz was alone in front of the vegetable patch, Thalia came closer. Why? Are you worried? Well, it's not that easy to be a tinker, isn't? It's strange that you didn't say you wanted to break those pots and jars? Thalia asked curiously. Franz glanced at the former and thought to himself, those were all ideas made a few years ago, but the development of the world is a bit elusive, and some of the original ideas simply couldn't be implemented. But Franz would not admit his failure, so he came up with another excuse. Some things cannot be dropped directly. You must glue them together first, otherwise the fragments may hurt yourself. Thalia also looked at Franz. The latter naturally understood what the former meant, but he did not want to continue this topic. How about the Royal Women's College? I've been very busy recently and haven't taken the time to go there. Everything is good, but as I said before, you don't have to have high expectations, because most of them are just ordinary people in the eyes of others, and they are also the kind that can't be tolerated. There is a very powerful Perini Schaffer. If she were not in this abnormal academy, she would definitely be sent to the lunatic asylum as a freak. A lunatic asylum in the 19th century was not a good place, especially one that specialized in treating women. What those doctors and nurses did was more like inhumane destruction than treatment. Those so-called treatments include putting people in wooden barrels, then heating them until the patient suffocates, and then putting the patient in an ice bucket in the basement until the patient is convulsing, and confining the person in a cabin without exposure to the sun. 24 hours inside, 3 hours hanging upside down. There are countless other treatment methods, of course. The scariest thing is surgical treatment. Doctors will randomly cut off some parts of the patient's body. He said he was sent to a lunatic asylum for treatment, but in fact it was just to shirk responsibility and get rid of his family. Because some nobles could not afford their daughters' dowries and did not want to disgrace their family status, they would send their daughters to a monastery with conscience, while some would sell their daughters to a lunatic asylum. Those so-called lunatic asylums are actually just places for some upper class nobles to have fun, because they can use them as special treatment methods to do whatever they want to the so-called patients. Not only is this legal, it's even reasonable. Sometimes, when a Janny needs extreme manpower, she will go to the lunatic asylum to look for it, because the people there, whether crazy or not, are desperately trying to escape from the devil's cave, and their actions are naturally full of courage. Franz didn't like this kind of lunatic asylum selling dog meat in sheep's clothing, so he destroyed a few of these dens. But the thoughts in people's minds cannot be killed. Unless people's mindset changes. The issue of treating people like garbage will always exist. Perini Schaffer, the daughter of the Schaffer family, shouldn't be too deviant. No, her father sent her here in the hope that she would be bombed one day, because Miss Perrine said that the Bible was a lie and that she would be a businessman in the future, but she was really talented. Thalia seems to admire this Miss Perrine very much, and Franz really needs an atheist. After all, religion must be limited in moderation, otherwise sooner or later it will become too big. It's not a big deal to get A's in all subjects. I could easily do it if it were me, but as a top student, Miss Perrine hopes to learn things that can't be learned in ordinary schools, so I called Mr. Sinner and his friends, who are also willing to discuss business with a woman. But what is really impressive is that Miss Bellini managed to use the 100 florins I funded her to earn 10,000 florins from her classmates and teachers. I won't be able to learn this kind of skill in my next life. Thalia is very self-aware of her own earning power, and she has to borrow money from Franz from time to time, who has so many IOUs that he can't even count them. If it is used as a threat, the postures currently known to humans should not be enough. Although Thalia was generous with her praises for Miss Perrine, Franz still had doubts about her ability to discern people. It wasn't until Thalia took out a set of photos that Franz said, "Seriously, then? You can tell her that I'm willing to provide 100,000 florins to support her. If she can make 10 times the profit within 6 years, I'm willing to hire her as my consultant." "What? If she can't do it?" Thalia said maliciously. "Then just return the principal and interest." Franz replied seriously. "Then should I talk to her about interest?" Thalia said with a smirk on her face. She really hoped that the two students she valued most could come together and create some sparks. Although they would definitely die in vain in the end. Shooting stars are most beautiful only when they fall, right? It's better not to talk about failure first. I hope she can succeed. After all, it's not easy to find a few talents in such a huge Austria. Franz sighed. "You want to give it to not many people, right?" Franz did not deny it. He nodded and said, "The vast majority of people's actions are less certain than mine, but you tire yourself to death sooner or later. Have you ever seen an emperor or a big businessman who does everything?" Why doesn't Franz understand what Thalia said? However, the lack of a supervision system and the overall moral decline of society have made it impossible for many people to use Franz with confidence. There are many people who are corrupted the moment they come into contact with power and immediately become contrary to their ideals and aspirations, and even turn swords against their companions, and even those with a strong will either be squeezed out or complicit in the big divat of Austrian officialdom at this time. Even with a backer like Franz, it is not easy to maintain one's true intentions, because corruption has corroded this country from top to bottom, from the inside out. When no one is greedy and everything is greedy, that normal person will appear abnormal. Therefore, Franz admired Baron Brook more and more. Even though he was sitting in the position of the governor of the central bank, he did not use his authority to benefit his own family. His car, bodyguards, and even his house were all issued by the Imperial government. But if you want to meet such a person, where can you find it? Thalia, in all conscience, I think the reward and punishment mechanism I have established is very reasonable. But why do some people always like to find new ways, or follow the old path? There was a trace of sadness and exhaustion in Franz's eyes, and Thalia sympathized with the prince. The burden on the former's shoulders seemed too heavy, but no one could share it for him. Reform takes time. Both you and the country need time. Corruption was not formed in a day, and you cannot eliminate it in a day. Thalia knocked off Franz's hand, lowered her head, and said with a frown, "Touch your own conscience." Chapter 480. Agriculturist. As a large agricultural country, Austria did not have an agricultural college, which puzzled Franz. However, after some investigation, he finally understood that at this time, agriculture was not generally regarded as a science in the Western world. The ancient Greeks considered agriculture a science, but the inheritance of civilization had long been interrupted. Franz has a group of agriculturists who are studying agricultural topics, as well as a large number of farmers and gardeners with excellent skills. Moreover, agriculture will have a profound impact on Austria's mainland and colonies for a long time to come, so it is imperative to establish an agricultural college. Now that we have experts and technicians, they can conduct innovative research, but they also need people to organize records and learn from the excellent experiences of other countries. Franz planned to hire a group of people to compile and translate agricultural books, but such a huge and important project was obviously not something ordinary people could do. So Franz once again targeted college students and job seekers who had nothing to do in Vienna. That's right, people with university diplomas can attend agricultural colleges for free. Not only are they free to study, but they are also free to eat. If they perform well, they can choose to become teachers and receive salary, and even have the opportunity to become officials. The conditions offered by Franz were naturally very attractive, but few people signed up. In fact, agriculture was not very popular at that time, and even farmers were a derogatory term. Only 58 students were recruited in the first phase, and more than half of them came for meals. In fact, there was a surplus of college students in Vienna at that time. The government did not have many positions to accommodate these guys, and they looked down on most types of jobs in the world. As a result, a large number of college students are waiting for employment in Vienna every year. Over time, a special group is formed. They drink coffee mixed with sawdust, but talk about national affairs. They are even more concerned about this than Ferdinand I. Nation. These people are destabilizing factors for the country, but they are also precious resources. After all, college students in this era are still a rare breed. It's just that not many people are willing to put aside their status and go to agricultural colleges to retrain. They are more willing to wait for official quotas allocated by the state. In fact, in addition to agricultural colleges, Franz also thought of many ways to consume these unemployed young people, such as reporters, teachers, colonial affairs officers, and low-level clerical jobs in enterprises, etc. Of course, the mainstream of this era is either to be an official, to do business, to be a clerk, etc. The starting point is still too low for college students, but here comes the problem. Austria has a conferment system. With Ferdinand I's physical condition, it would be good to hold a conferment ceremony once a week. And although there are 80,000 civil servants in Austria, in fact 80% of the positions are fixed and inherited, and even if there is a replacement, they will be selected from one or several families coupled with the so-called civil service grading system. It is extremely difficult for ordinary people to climb up. The class of each official is almost determined from the beginning. It's not that Franz doesn't want to move, but if he moves, he will be against the 80% of people. At this time, he doesn't have the strength yet, and the time is not yet right. And according to Franz, some non-public positions are as important as officials, and there is no distinction between them. Historically, North Germany and France had formal agricultural education much earlier than the Austrians. The first agricultural college was established in the Principality of Holstein under Danish control in 1803. In 1818, the Hohenheim College was established. In the same year, the Bavarian Agricultural Club was established. In 1819, the Lowell Agricultural College in France was established. In 1836, the Alsace Agricultural College was established. However, because Franz attracted a group of top talents of this era, such as Liebig, and developed a number of agricultural machinery himself, Austria's agricultural technology is still far ahead in Europe. But if agricultural colleges are not established, this advantage will sooner or later be erased over time. If you want to maintain your advantage in the long term, you still need to cultivate professional talents and conduct continuous research. Of course, Franz still has some knowledge of later generations, and coupled with his status as a royal prince, he can get many good things that others cannot. For example, the Qing dynasty's Luhe chicken and Jiu Jinhuang were the best laying hen breeds in the world at this time. Although there was still a gap between the artificially bred laying hens of later generations, the output of laying hens was already 1.33 times that of common laying hens in Europe at this time. Annual egg production is 200 plus. The latter is a very good broiler breed. As the name suggests, this kind of chicken can grow to 9 pounds. At this time, the common broiler chickens in the east and the west only weigh 4 to 5 pounds. Even the monster white feathered chickens artificially bred in later generations. It is only about half of Jiu Jinhuang. However, Jiu Jinhuang has a long growth cycle, which takes 200 to 230 days, and the meat to feed ratio is slightly higher, but this does not prevent it from beating European broiler breeds at this time. In addition, Franz had to say that the European native chicken breeds at this time were really terrible. Basically, there are two characteristics. One is to eat a lot, and the other is to grow slowly. At this time, several popular chicken breeds in Europe were typical slow finished products of later generations, such as breast chicken, The reason why this thing was not artificially eliminated, like other breeds, was because someone connected it with France. However, this kind of chicken is a famous aristocratic ingredient, and it can be called the dominant among chickens. One meal can make people bankrupt. The other type is the famous Dujin chicken. This chicken is small and produces few eggs, but it has a strong skin, requires almost no special feeding, and has few diseases. Another characteristic is that he has excellent fighting power. He often pecks and injures dogs, and can even fight with peregrine falcons. He is a famous fighting chicken. Of course, he will still fight with golden eagles and the like. Other breeds of chickens were also killed instantly. France can introduce new breeds of chickens and cross them with local chickens to create the most suitable breed possible. Of course, we also got some all-around players. For example, the 3 yellow chicken does not produce as much meat as the 9 yellow chicken, and does not produce as many eggs as the Ree chicken, or even as good as the local chickens in Europe. However, it has the advantage that the strengths of all parties are well balanced, and it has fewer patients, and is easier to feed. After all, modern agriculture was just beginning at this time, and most farmers would probably only do free-range farming. In addition, France had a deep understanding of what it means to have a millionaire family, and those with hair and arms are not counted. The first modern chicken farm in Austria that he established on the outskirts of Vienna was also the largest chicken farm on the European continent at this time. When chicken plague broke out, France had to get rid of broilers and laying hens worth millions of florins. In fact, he was lucky at first, thinking that he could solve the problem by just getting rid of part of it, but the matter was much more serious than he imagined. In the end, the chicken plague spread throughout the chicken farm, and even some breeders began to have fever and coma. Only then did Franz order all the chickens to be disposed of and fully disinfected, including the chicken house, personnel, and utensils, to end this tragic encounter. However, it was soon reported that chicken plague did not occur in other chicken houses and farmers' free-range chickens, and only Franz's hybrid chickens were affected. He then realized that the virus was targeting Asian chickens, so European chickens had no reaction. Sure enough, it was too tiring to rely on Franz alone, and a large agricultural country must transform into an agricultural power, so it was imperative to establish an agricultural college. I need a favor from book friends. If you find typos or the like, please reply to the message and I will try to correct them as soon as possible. Chapter 481, Reincarnation of Heaven. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. I have to say that rabbits are really incredibly fertile. The original dozen rabbits have grown into more than 100 rabbits in just over 2 months. This breed was crossbred with various versions of Angora rabbits, and then crossed with Belgian giant rabbits under Maria's random command. Not only does it grow quickly, it has a strong ability to give birth, it is also larger in size, and its personality is stable and its quality is equally stable. But there is a fatal flaw. Compared with Angora rabbits, the quality of its fur is inferior, because there are too many colors, which greatly affects the appearance. The most valuable thing about Angora rabbits is their fur, not their meat. However, Franz still felt that he should eat well, and wear warm clothes first, and then think about other things. He decided to send more than 100 rabbits to a manor outside the city, to establish a breeding farm, and then build up the industry first. As for the genuine German Angora rabbits, they can be cultivated slowly. After all, luxury goods are the most profitable. There is a more important problem, and that is that these damn rabbits are about to eat up the lawn of Schönbrunn Palace. The gardeners in the palace have complained to Madame Sophie many times. After all, if the beauty of the lawn is lacking, they will be punished. After Franz heard about it, he immediately sent the rabbit out of Schönbrunn Palace. After all, for high-level big shots, it is always easier to solve the problem than to solve the problem. In the study, Archbishop Prussia has been waiting for him for a long time. What he brought was a personal letter from Pedro Santana, as well as some gifts from the latter. Of course, Dominica was a poor place at this time, and naturally it couldn't produce any valuable rare items. The value was about £25,000, mainly some gold products. Archduke Franz and General Pedro Santana seem to be more enthusiastic, and he very much hopes to get our support, and is willing to let Austria set up a development company in Dominica to jointly develop local resources. He even stated that Dominica could become a colony of Austria, but before that he needed sufficient support. This is the model adopted by Austria in Mexico. This approach gave the dictator Tazanana a large amount of funds to effectively suppress the local rebellion. In contrast, Juan Pablo Duarte appeared to be much more disrespectful. He hoped that Austria would not interfere with Dominica's freedom. As for the so-called support, he hoped it would be free or repaid in the form of debt. This naive idea puts a political idiot like Russia to shame. Franz roughly understood the situation of the two. The so-called support of the former must be a lion's mouth, and it is not worthy of belief. He can offer prices to Austria, and he can also offer prices to France, Britain, and the United States. Franz did not want to participate in the auction at all. Even if Pedro Santana was sincere, he would not accept the former, because the timing was wrong. Entering too early would most likely result in being sold out by the other three influential people in America at this time. Countries are targeting. Especially for Spain's former colonies like Dominica. France and Spain had too many ways to make Austria uneasy, and there was also the UK as a troublemaker, so Franz had to guard against it. Although the Yankees are weak at this time, they are full of bad intentions. The first people in history to try to build the Panama Canal were actually the French, but they underestimated the Americans and were disgraced by them. In the end, they could only admit that they were unlucky, lose money and leave. As for the latter's reaction and behavior, Franz actually expected it. This kind of person would not be able to be a dog without breaking his head and bleeding. What Franz wants now is to wait and see what happens, and don't let this naive guy be played to death. After all, Juan Pablo Duarte had a wide range of supporters in the Dominican Republic, especially his influence among the people that did not completely dissipate until 100 years after his death. The purpose of the supplies sent to the Dominican Republic was to win over people's hearts and make the local people, especially the conservative forces, remember Austria's favor and pave the way for further plans in the future. The Archbishop asks you to tell that careerist that we only fight for God and the people. Franz's words were very high sounding, but they made Archbishop Russia feel like a breath of fresh air, because the latter had wanted to say this for a long time. Okay, Archduke Franz. One more thing, there is news from the Far East. It seems that Nanming is going to take direct action against the British. What? Southeast Asia, Kalimantan. More than 2,000 British troops huddled in the fortress and were bombarded with heavy artillery by the Nanming army for 6 hours. After finally surviving the day, Hu Gao ordered the vanguard of the breakout troops to retreat. As soon as they went out, there were traps and animal traps everywhere in the forest. The British soldiers who had been trapped had already turned into corpses the next day. The bombardment started again. The gunners of the Nanming army were obviously very lack of training. The impact points of the bullets were very strange and there was no pattern at all. But as long as these ship-based guns can hit anything near the target, they can directly send everyone nearby to the west. Some people couldn't stand the feeling of waiting to die and rushed out, but except for a few people in Nanming, no one could understand English. So no matter whether the British troops who rushed out wanted to fight or surrender, the Nanming army would open fire and kill them first. Finally, Hu Gao put down his military dignity, raised the white flag, and ordered the soldiers to surrender. The original team of 2,700 people now only has 800 people left, including a large number of wounded soldiers. But Hu Gao overlooked one thing. This is the eastern battlefield, not the western battlefield. His surrender made the soldiers of Nanming feel that the foreigners had no integrity, let alone the courage to commit suicide. Therefore, the Nanming soldiers who captured them were not polite at all. They greeted them with fists and kicks, accompanied by constant abuse. Even Hu Gao, as a general, did not receive any courtesy. This was completely different from the Western tradition of treating captured officers well. After all, in the past Western wars relied on mercenaries, and everyone was just for money. If a noble is captured, he is the god of wealth. He will take good care of him and entertain him with good food and drink. After all, if he dies, the money will be gone. But wars in the East are often life and death battles. In addition, East Asia is deeply influenced by Confucianism, and the word integrity is what matters. Being a prisoner and surrendering to the enemy was something that few people in history could clean up, except for that red-faced man. At this time, Hu Gao finally saw the woman who made him a prisoner. Looking at the woman wearing a costume, he couldn't help but laugh. Hu Gao found it very funny. Although he didn't like the East, he still recognized that it was a costume from an Oriental stage play. However, he was actually defeated by such a ridiculous woman and a group of barbarians. He only found it funny. The military attachés of Nanming on the side were obviously very dissatisfied with Hu Gao's behavior. They did not feel that a defeated general had the right to laugh at their leader, the Emperor of Nanming. Kneel down. Liu Dadao kicked Hu Gao hard at the knee. This kick, which he had accumulated for more than 30 years, directly deformed the latter's leg. Hu Gao knelt on the ground and roared through gritted teeth, "Kill me please. Chow." Although Liu Dadao didn't understand, he understood what the other party meant. According to Liu Dadao's character, he wished he could kill the arrogant guy in front of him. But the other party was a high official, and Zhu Qiangying was still present. While hesitating, Luo Xiangnan grabbed his sword, and Xian was also explaining to Zhu Qiangying how important Hu Gao was. "Kill him." Everyone was stunned, including Liu Dadao, who had been wanting to kill someone. "No, your majesty. Killing a prisoner is unlucky, and this person can be exchanged for a lot of ransom, and is an important bargaining chip. Kill him." Zhu Qiangying repeated. This time Liu Dadao did not hesitate, and separated the body of the undefeated god of war of the British Empire with one strike. Xian and Luo Xiangnan stared blankly at what was happening in front of them. Zhu Qiangying stood up and left and spoke to an old man with long braids next to him. "This head is yours too. Your story is very good, but don't come here with your braids again, otherwise you will also get your head on the ground." The old man with Manchu braids bowed 3 times and kowtowed 9 times in the direction Zhu Qiangying left, and then carefully placed the head into a sandalwood box filled with lime powder. 3 months later, Jiangsu, Hualien in front of a newly built earth-engraven Guan cemetery, 2 lime-covered human heads and a pig's head were neatly placed. An old man cried bitterly and could not kneel down. "I need a favor from book friends. If you find typos or the like, please reply to the message and I will try to correct them as soon as possible." Chapter 482 Friedrich and -039 S Life of Fantasy. In the Indian Ocean, in order to show weakness to the enemy, Friedrich chose to only use steam engines to heat hot water along the way. The propellers of his own warships were not started at all, and they drifted everywhere by the wind. The British who were traveling with them had a strong interest in the Austrian fleet. After all, the latter's record was not bad. Although the methods are despicable, the winner should not be condemned. This is the consensus among Western military circles as for showing weakness to the enemy. It was naturally proposed by Franz. He did not want Friedrich to show all his cards to the opponent when he was too complacent. From the British perspective, the performance of the Austrian navy along the way was astonishing. At first, this fleet left the British fleet far behind. But soon the British discovered that there was a serious disconnect between the Austrian fleets. The frigates and cruisers that were supposed to open the way were left behind. The troop transports and baggage ships actually ran faster than the frigates. At the front were 3 super first-class battleships. Immediately afterwards, the British discovered something even more incredible. That is, the Austrian fleet as a whole had slowed down, and the commander of the British fleet, Lieutenant General Raven Hobbock, thought that the other party was waiting for him. But soon the British ships overtook the Austrian side and left the latter far behind. In desperation, Vice Admiral Raven Hobbock had to ask the fleet to slow down and wait for the Austrians to come up. After a while of communication, the two sides realized that it was the steam engines of the Austrian navy that had collectively broken down. The British laughed for almost a month because of this kind of thing, but after a month they couldn't laugh anymore because the sailing speed was too slow. The Austrians had to rest for a while in every colony they visited, and even launched several battles in modern times. The regular army and the indigenous troops engaged in frontal combat on the plains, which really had little ornamental value. Lieutenant General Ravenhobert politely asked Marshal Friedrich if he needed help, and the former decisively agreed. Then the British army had to organize manpower to help the Austrians dig ditches for several weeks. Although the pay was not bad, it always felt strange. Finally, the two fleets arrived at the Cape of Good Hope. Lieutenant General Ravenhobert even thought about what to say at Friedrich's memorial service. After all, the stability of Austrian warships was too poor, and 99% of them would not survive the killing. The result was that the steam power of the Austrian navy suddenly resumed, and then disappeared from the sight of Vice Admiral Ravenhobert at lightning speed. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant General Ravenhobert finally met Friedrich again in Bagamoyo. The latter, however, had already fought a war in East Africa. When Friedrich suddenly appeared on the coast of East Africa with the Austrian navy, both Benny Urban and said were frightened. The former, the governor of Tanzania, has lost his temper. He trusts his black brother too much, which makes him too arrogant. He wants to kill his eldest brother and become the chief himself. He also contacted the Oman Empire to dedicate Bagamoyo to said in exchange for support. The latter is considering whether to break up with Austria. After all, he has been keeping a low profile for such a long time, purchasing warships from Britain, France, Spain, and Austria, and retraining sailors, and his strength has been restored to 7 or 8 points. In fact, the fleet of the Oman Empire is stronger than before, but it lost too many outstanding generals and sailors in the naval battle with Austria, which will be difficult to recover. Letting inexperienced sailors fight pirates is tantamount to death. In Said's mind, the Austrian navy was much more powerful than the wandering pirates. He still remembered his city and palace that turned into a sea of fire. Then the sudden appearance of the Austrian fleet directly broke the tranquility. Friedrich's first stop was Zanzibar, not Bagamoyo. This shocked the entire Oman Empire. Some ministers proposed to let Sultan Said escape immediately, while others advocated fighting to the end. At this moment, a eunuch ran into the palace rolling and crawling. The Austrian fleet has arrived outside the port, and Jabri Pasha is negotiating with it. This time the Austrian fleet is larger than the last time. This news made the princes and ministers of Oman feel ashamed, because now it was too late to fight or escape. Because the Omani navy was scattered everywhere and still relied on sail power, they expected that the Austrians would take 3 days to arrive at the fastest, but they arrived in 1 day. This speed is really incredible. However, Said the Great was worthy of being the man who pushed the Oman Empire to its peak. He immediately stopped the noisy officials. Go and bring the Tanzanian envoy and some more gold, silver and jewelry. We will go to the dock to greet our distinguished guest. A murderous intent that was not easy to detect flashed in the eyes of Emperor Said, and a eunuch immediately disappeared among the crowd. Emperor Said and the princes and nobles of Oman received the Austrian fleet with the highest courtesy. Friedrich, who was only 1.58 meters tall, stood in front of Said. Before the former could speak, the latter presented a gift, pushed the black envoy from Tanzania out, and told the whole story. The whole story was told. Finally, it was reiterated that the Oman Empire will always be a good friend and trustworthy partner of the Austrian Empire. As long as Friedrich said a word, he would immediately send troops to help the governor of Tanzania quell the chaos. Friedrich just opened a notebook, flipped through it, and exchanged a few words with the other party. He came this time just to intimidate the other side. After all, Franz said that keeping the Oman Empire was actually beneficial to the Austrian side. After all, this East African overlord is ferocious enough and can scare away many competitors. Without this guy, Austria will have to deal with a lot more troubles and may face more terrifying opponents. In that case, the East African colonies would no longer be valuable, but would become a liability. Moreover, Emperor Said was indeed generous in his actions. Each gift he gave was worth more than £1 million. Even a person like Friedrich who never cared about money would be moved by it. But this was a different story in Said's eyes. He only took one look at so many gold and silver jewels and then looked away. You must know that his sons couldn't walk when they saw so many treasures. Then there are only two possibilities. One is that the other party does not care about money at all, and the other is that the other party is an extremely loyal general who will not keep these personal gifts. Said couldn't help but break into a cold sweat when he thought of this. He was wondering what kind of opponent he was facing point, but no matter what, he will try. Even if there is only 1% hope, he will do it. Your Excellency, Marshal, can you please come to my palace to attend the dinner? Friedrich turned over the notebook in his hand and suddenly frowned. You want to kill me? Just a simple sentence. Frightened, said to the ground. I don't dare. I absolutely don't dare. I just think that the Marshal has worked hard all the way. He has a distinguished status and is not yet married. I want to dedicate my daughter to you. The Ottoman Empire and the Austrian Empire will marry so that our two countries can be together forever. The book in Friedrich's hand was written by Franz, and it was full of some commonly used strategies in the East. After all, the former family seemed to have problems in dealing with the world, and the cultural differences between the East and the West were also relatively large. For example, it is not necessarily a good thing for a weak person to invite a strong person to dinner, especially when the two may be in a hostile relationship. Chapter 483, Drinking and Talking. Said was horrified that his plan was seen through. He did not expect that this humble little man had actually seen through his thoughts. Yes, the Sultan, whose ambition has not diminished, did hold a banquet at Hangman, waiting for the generals of the Austrian navy to be introduced to the palace, before planning a siege and finally seizing the fleet and the port point. If you are an arrogant, stupid and unfamiliar with the rules of the Eastern game, you may indeed make this mistake. But it is a pity that Franz is well versed in the rules of the Eastern game, and although Friedrich is arrogant, he is not stupid. Said's words just now caused Friedrich to think deeply. He felt that he was almost at the age of marriage. Generally speaking, the marriage of a royal member like him must be in line with the interests of the family, which means that it is usually decided by the clan leader. It's just that the current Emperor Ferdinand I probably doesn't have the ability, nor the mood to study his marriage. The history of the Habsburg family is not without pagan marriages. The first one was his father, Archduke Karol. But marrying an Arab is very exciting when you think about it, but there are other ways. For example, like Grand Duke Ambrosius, simply asking Queen Chinla to convert to Christianity can solve the problem. It's just that there is a big difference between Frederick and Ambrosius. After all, one is a direct line of the royal family, while the other is a side branch of the branch. Although Friedrich wanted to cause trouble, he didn't have the right, let alone the courage. But it's okay to see what the other person looks like first. Friedrich looked at the panicked Said in front of him and comforted him. It's not that I don't believe you, but I've recently contracted a disease that will kill me if I leave the ship too far. So why not hold the dinner on my flagship? You can bring the food and the princess, eh? Like concocted by Friedrich suddenly overloaded Said's brain. He didn't believe it at first, but then he felt relieved when he thought that the Emperor of Austria at this time was said to be an idiot who could only wake up for 2 hours a day. The latter couldn't help feeling that the world was full of wonders, and at the same time began to worry about the rest of his daughter's life. Although he was very reluctant to give up, Said could only dedicate his favorite daughter, Princess Sneaker, because only this princess was the smartest, most beautiful, best able to fight for the interests of the Ottoman Empire, and at the same time, could speak German. Said separated power and family affection very closely. For the sake of his power and his empire, he could abandon his parents, brothers, wife, and children. The conversation between Friedrich and Said left the entourage of both parties in a state of confusion. They were tense just now, but then they turned around and were about to talk about marriage. This is really easy for people to not react. However, the officials on the Oman side can understand it. After all, they saw with their own eyes that the Austrian fleet was more terrifying than the legend said, and they could fully understand the Sultan's behavior at this time. After all, a good man never suffers immediate losses, and daughters are really not a valuable item in the Arab world. At this time, women were in a subordinate position in the Arab world, and sometimes women could even be executed in honor for the sake of family reputation. Therefore, if you can use it for marriage, you can make the best use of it, and I well. When Said boarded the super first-class battleship Venetia, his performance was not much better than that of his second son Majid. Said was not ignorant. He had boarded a British 74-gun battleship and purchased 2 of them with his own money point, but the Venetia in front of him was twice the size of an ordinary 74-gun battleship. This was indeed a shock to the East African overlord. He stayed in place stupidly for a long time. The princes and officials of Oman who were accompanying him also lowered their heads. They couldn't help but admire Maid, because they would not have dared to engage in a firefight with such a terrifying fleet. Friedrich only invited a few military officers and Omani senior officials to dinner, so security was not difficult to handle. Oman was very efficient. Temporary tents were immediately set up near the port, and various delicacies were continuously delivered to the ship. There were even dancers and bands coming to add to the fun. Friedrich seemed to be lacking in interest, while Said was preoccupied. On the contrary, the economic officials from both sides were talking very speculatively. After all, the conditions offered by Austria are too generous compared to the Portuguese and British, and the market is not generally large. This is natural. After all, Austria has a monopoly on Oman spices, so it will naturally do its best. As for the so-called broad market, it is naturally the German customs union, the Apennine customs union, and Russia. Compared to guys like the UK and Portugal who eat people without spitting out their bones, France naturally appears to be much kinder. But in fact, the profit of the latter is higher than that of the former, because of the monopoly. France can adopt a policy of small profits but quick turnover. On the one hand, his citizens and allies can enjoy benefits, and on the other hand, Austria and Oman can also earn more. The only consequence is to seize the market share of the Netherlands, Portugal, and the United Kingdom, forcing these guys who can eat people without spitting out their bones to lower their prices. Of course, if these idiots can come up with any kind of price alliance, France is guaranteed to beat them to the point where their mothers won't recognize them. The Dutch East Indies suffered huge losses due to Austria's troubles, but it didn't matter to the Dutch mainland, especially since the King of the Netherlands wished that those guys in the Dutch East Indies would die early, so that his government could better control the overseas colonies. Britain and Portugal were completely driven out of the German and Italian markets by Austria. However, they are not too concerned about the spice trade now, but focus mainly on the most valuable commodity in the 19th century, opium. The abuse of opium was prohibited in the Austrian Empire. There was no reason why the emperor didn't like it, the church didn't like it, and the people at the bottom were not so desperate that they couldn't live without opium. Therefore, opium has always been treated as a harmful drug in Austria. This is inseparable from the propaganda of the nobility and the church. This is exactly what is said. In fact, medicine in Austria has developed much faster than in history. So many diseases do not require doctors to use narcotics. While the church was crazily promoting Chinese medicine, it also killed a large number of rogue doctors who only bled patients and drank laudanum. In fact, the level of traditional Chinese medicine in the church has developed very rapidly, because there are a large number of believers and poor people who can use their skills to practice, and there is no so-called hiding of secrets within the church. The doctors of the church consider this to be the property of the church. A large number of exchanges and practices, coupled with mutual learning, have allowed the overall level of this organization to improve rapidly. Of course, the Austrian church is also divided into 2 factions. One faction believes that the same disease is treated in the same way, and failure to cure it is God's will, because the patient and the rescuer are not pious enough. Another school of thought believes that God is merciful, and the reason why the cure cannot be cured is because the rescuer does not understand God's language, and that the symptoms of those patients are actually a revelation. Therefore, the same disease should not be treated together. Finally, the 2 sides started to compete to determine the outcome, and the latter was naturally the winner. As a result, the development of traditional Chinese medicine in Austria has entered the fast lane. On the contrary, Western medicine, which France heavily funded, has not produced any decent results. The anesthesia technology that was finally born under the urging of Franz himself was plagiarized and stolen by the church. In fact, although the ideas of these magicians are outrageous, they have found a new way to reach the threshold of the highest realm of traditional Chinese medicine. Instant sleep. Chapter 484. Drink and talk. The banquet is still going on, and the dance performance in the middle is also interesting to everyone in front of them. Of course, the unsociable Friedrich was worrying about the roasted camel in front of him. He never expected that the Arabs would bring a whole camel up. In fact, this is not the usual way Omaners eat, but the Austrian officials who were accompanying them specifically asked Archduke Friedrich to have a separate meal. So a whole cooked camel was placed in front of Friedrich. He held a knife and fork in his hand and looked feebly at the delicious food in front of him. The various dates and pies just now were almost eaten by this distinguished guest from the European continent. The Omani officials who also accompanied the Austrian guests also asked the Austrian guests not to serve wine because it was an offense to the Holy Sultan. Without wine and the delicious food in front of him was not to his taste. Friedrich was naturally not in high spirits. But a burst of melodious music sounded, and he couldn't help but open his jaw wide, and the camel meat that was close to his mouth fell to the ground. Although those dancers with gauze faces, cool clothes and graceful figures did not arouse the slightest interest in this vigorous young nobleman, the eyes of the woman in a purple dance costume who came on stage at this time had a soul-stirring power like a ghost. Friedrich only took one look and became obsessed, but said frowned at the side. I saw the waist of the purple-robed dancer dancing like a snake. It was difficult for people to combine plumpness and slenderness, but the woman in front of me just did it. Charming yet elegant, with some exotic touches, especially the unruly temperament in his eyes, which is very much in line with the Austrian prince's appetite. After the dance, the purple-clothed dancer walked towards his direction. But of course she was pointed at by several guns. After all, Friedrich had the dual status of a member of the royal family and a naval marshal, so his security was of course very strict. The dancer's unusual behavior immediately alerted the Austrian side. As soon as the guards made a move, groups of marines immediately ran out from below the deck. Said wanted to resist, but he immediately realized that this approach was tantamount to seeking death. Friedrich spoke, but not to ask his men to put down their guns, but to ask questions to the dancer. May I have your name? Before the translator could speak, the other person spoke in German. My name is Sneaker, the Princess of Oman, your future wife. Princess Sneaker crossed her hands on her chest and saluted respectfully. Although they are simple actions and short words, there is a sense of amazement. This is my daughter Sneaker, my heart's content. But for the sake of peace and friendship between the two countries and the two families, I'm willing to dedicate her to you. The next day Friedrich took Princess Sneaker to Bagamoyo. At this time, the governor Beni Urban did not know how to explain to the Grand Duke. In order to control Tanzania better and faster, Nurbin chose to support his brother. Of course, this was also out of selfish motives. As a result, after the other party's wings became stronger, he in turn took up the idea of Bagamoyo. Of course, if his brother only liked Bagamoyo, maybe Beni Urban would have joined him at this time. But the reality is that his black brother wants to kill him as well. After all, Urban is the old chief's designated heir, but this was not important to Friedrich or Franz. The latter just needed an agent, while the former just wanted to show off his strength in front of his fiancée. Friedrich liked the Princess Sneaker very much. Not only was she beautiful, she was even good at discussing military affairs. This made him, as the commander of the navy, feel that he had met a confidant in his life, but this confidant did not seem to believe that he could easily defeat an entire black army of firearms. You must know that the Ouijan kingdom has always been one of the most powerful black kingdoms in East Africa, and in recent years, Beni Urban has used his power to support it. The Nyambe family, the Ouijan royal family, already has a force of 13,000 people and is equipped with a large number of firearms. Even the Oman Empire at this time is not willing to go to land to gnaw this difficult bone. Moreover, Friedrich's entire fleet may not add up to 13,000 people. You'd better ask for help from your own country. The kingdom of Ouijan has occupied Paradise Castle and built defense facilities nearby. Without 3 times their strength, it's best not to provoke them. Princess Sneaker analyzed that her words were very pertinent and professional. Generally speaking, one should do what Her Royal Highness the Princess says, but this is still an unequal battle. I've seen your performance before, and it was very exciting. Now it's time for you to see my performance. Princess Sneaker just sighed softly and thought to herself, why are men so stubborn? My father is like this, so are my brothers, and so is the European prince in front of me. But In her personal opinion, this is not a bad thing. After all, such a man is easier to control. I just hope he doesn't die too soon, otherwise my monarch father might marry him to a black man. As for Benny Urban on the side, he did not receive the punishment he imagined, nor did he receive the comfort he did not dare to expect. He was just completely ignored. It was as if the governor of Tanzania had never existed. Friedrich's troops easily controlled Bagamoyo, and Urban's trusted confidants also distanced themselves from him. Princess Sneaker asked cautiously on the way back, Grand Duke Friedrich, you seem to have forgotten to deal with Mr. Benny Urban. Do you want to wait until the war is over to deal with it? No, this kind of thing is not my business. I have a great nephew who will take care of it, Friedrich said with a smile. His expression did not seem to be fake, and Princess Sneaker did not continue to ask. Paradise. This is a fortress built by the Portuguese in order to permanently conquer this land in East Africa, but they failed. Because the Portuguese always have mysterious self-confidence, they like to abandon strong fortresses and compete with the Omanis on the plains and deserts. The result was that the forts never served their intended purpose. Biru Nyambe was Benny Urban's younger brother, but he was a black man and was not under the influence of their father, King Yi Nyambe. See you soon. But this does not affect Nyambe becoming the most powerful conqueror in Tanzania. 3 of the 7 major tribes were wiped out by the Austrians, and he wiped out 2 more. Coupled with a large amount of Western-style equipment, the Wejan Empire is at its greatest moment in history. Biru Nyambe's ambition is not just to be the king of Tanzania. He wants to defeat the Omanis, invade India, and become the king of the world. In the eyes of the Wejan family of this era, the world only covers an area from East Africa to India. Europeans are outsiders and do not belong to this world, so betraying and expelling them is God's will. But he is not a fool and will never step out of his fortress so that the Wejan kingdom can remain invincible. One day later, the pretentious chief was buried under the ruins of Paradise Castle. Chapter 485. Trip to India. The Battle of Paradise Castle started too suddenly and ended even more suddenly. I don't know how to describe it here. The Wejan kingdom's army collapsed almost as soon as the Austrian army appeared. The death of the leader later restored the army to its original state, a tribal armed force. The corpses of black soldiers were everywhere inside and outside Paradise Castle. The wizard of the tribe was directly hit by a siege rocket and turned into a piece of mud stuck on the wall. Without their spiritual leader, the group of soldiers who thought the bullets were magic immediately fled. The battle ended before many of the new equipment Friedrich brought were put to use, which left him feeling unsatisfied. On the side, Princess Sneaker, who pretended to be calm on the surface, was already turbulent inside. She had seen the scimitar warriors raised in her family riding high on war horses, but in front of the troops of this European nobleman, they were like clowns riding wooden horses. And this is just Austria's navy. I really don't know how terrifying their army will be. But Sneaker quickly calmed down and chatted and laughed with Friedrich as usual. A few days later, the British fleet finally arrived. Lieutenant General Raven Hobart complained bitterly that he had been searching the waters of the Cape of Good Hope for several days, but could not even find the wreckage of the Austrian warship. In desperation, Friedrich had to entertain him again. However, the depressed look of the city of Bagamoyo at this time made the British feel happy. They felt that these Austrian rookies really didn't know how to run a colony, and such a good place had turned into such a horrible state. After a few days rest, the Anglo-Austrian fleet set off again and arrived in Mumbai first. The local Indians held a grand welcome ceremony for them. This made Lieutenant General Hobart very gratified. Although he did not like these lowly Indian ants, he was still very satisfied with the fact that he could show his majesty in front of his Austrian counterparts. However, the British soon discovered that something was wrong. Yes, these Indians came to welcome the Austrians, not their masters. There is nothing that can be done about this. After all, the smuggling trade between Austria and India is prevalent at this time. As for the loyalty of businessmen, they have a flexible moral bottom line. They naturally follow whoever makes money and who they are loyal to. The UK has seen the Third Brothers double dealing too many times in recent years. However, Lieutenant General Raven Hobart did not connect these two things. After all, they were thousands of miles apart. Mainly because in the eyes of the British, Indians seem to treat everyone the same. In short, they are inferior people who like to beg for mercy from others. Friedrich actually didn't like Indians very much, but Princess Sneaker was very interested in these guys who acted according to the circumstances, and found them mysterious and interesting. Point and these arson became even more attentive after learning about the marriage between the Austrian Empire and the Oman Empire, because in their eyes, the Oman Empire was an existence that could rival the British Empire, and would bring them a lot of benefits. As the representative of the Indian businessmen, Vera Wise naturally expressed her feelings. Other businessmen and princes who wanted to join the Austrian line also invested money to prepare for a grand wedding. Point of course, this is just a unilateral overinterpretation by the Indians. Friedrich and Princess Sneaker were only engaged, and it was the kind that did not get the consent of the Habsburg family. Point. Although there was no wedding in the end, there was still a grand celebration. Point. The unmarried couple had a great time. Friedrich lamented that Franz had extended Austria's influence to the South Asian subcontinent, while Sneaker became increasingly alarmed by the power of that empire. Point. Lieutenant General Raven Hobbuck and Baron Billy Mullen Jr., the head of the British investigation team, had unhappy expressions, but they only laughed at the ignorance and stupidity of the Indians. After all, the Austrian Navy's ungrateful behavior, especially its deviant behavior of disembarking from ships and engaging in land battles with others, was not worthy of being an opponent of the British Empire. Point. In fact, Lieutenant General Hobbuck was very depressed in his heart. The Austrians were causing trouble on land along the way. He also wanted to find a pirate to practice his skills, but it seemed that God was deliberately making things difficult for him. In these days, no one took the initiative to send him the prey that comes to your door. In fact, any pirate who sees a formation of dozens of battleships will avoid them, and any thought of provoking them is tantamount to seeking death. Point. After leaving Bombay and arriving in Calcutta, the locals behaved even more exaggeratedly. This time, not only Indians, but also the British compatriots of Lieutenant General Raven Hobbuck also joined the welcoming team, and even awarded Friedrich honorary mayor's medal. This series of actions almost shocked the general. In fact, he did not know that the Austrian fleet had ever visited here. Point. After all, it happened to coincide with the Indian Ocean tsunami, and many citizens and officials in Calcutta were rescued from the rubble by Austrian naval soldiers, and later, under Franz's strict control, Calcutta became the least affected and best recovered area in India, almost eliminating secondary disasters. On the contrary, plagues broke out in other places one after another. On the one hand, it is out of gratitude, and on the other hand, it is because Calcutta is also the hardest hit area for the smuggling trade with Austria. Point. Colonial officials know very well that no matter how much they earn from normal trade, they may not always be thieves, but smuggling is completely different. Even if the tax point is low, they can still make a lot of money. Therefore, officials here have also established a deep friendship with Austria. However, there were still some people in Calcutta who did not welcome the arrival of the Austrians, such as the opium merchants Albert Sassoon, the eldest son of David Sassoon, the Sassoon family known as the Rothschilds of the East and the mastermind behind the Opium War, was so frightened that he peed his pants and hid in a tree without even daring to go home. Dare not enter the house. This is because Franz held a banquet in Calcutta in order to win people's hearts, and this Albert Sassoon brought boxes of opium with a group of opium merchants. Franz didn't know what the other person was thinking, but he only knew that he was unhappy and had to do something. Albert Sassoon said that he asked 2 royal princes to taste the quality of opium, but he knew very well that such young people were most likely to become addicted to drugs, because their strong competitiveness and strong desire for knowledge would make them addicted to drugs. They take it upon themselves to try this horrible stuff. As a result, Franz locked a group of opium merchants in a room that was almost flooded by seawater. In fact, it was almost like a water prison. In the cold sea water, these people have no food, only laudanum and pipes, and the guards outside will provide them with this without limit. Several people died after being imprisoned for just 1 day, but Franz didn't care. He only said that he would be imprisoned for another 2 days, so Friedrich forgot about it and only remembered it a week later. In the end, only single digits of the 30 or so opium merchants survived. These people relied on drinking opium and eating rat carcasses to maintain basic body functions, so Albert Sassoon, a drug lord who was feared by people in East Asia, hid in a tree and shivered when he heard that the Austrians were back. However, Franz did not forget this family. He even prepared coffins for these people. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 486. Let's talk again. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz, who finally had time to relax in the study with his eyes closed, was a little curious as to why he hadn't received any news from Nanming yet. Little did he know that Friedrich was still on his way to Kalimantan at this time, and the development of the situation had exceeded his expectations. After thinking for a moment, he glanced at a huge map hanging on the wall to the right of the desk. In 1815, Prague had a population of only 70,000, of which 50,000 were Germans, 15,000 were Czechs, and the rest were from other ethnic groups in history. By 1844, the population of this important imperial town soared to 180,000, including 158,000 Germans, 15,000 Czechs, and the vast majority of the rest were Jews. Prague currently has a population of 380,000. Making it the second largest city in the empire after Vienna, among which the German population is as high as 300,000. The second largest ethnic group is the Jews, 50,000. The Czechs only have about 20,000, and the rest it is other ethnic groups. By the way, historically Prague was only open to traffic in 1845. However, Prague today is still the area with the most violent nationalism outside Hungary. However, what is different from history is that this time there is not only Czech nationalism, but also German nationalism. The former opposed the imperial dictatorship and demanded autonomy equal to that of Hungary, including independent taxation and military. The latter firmly supports the rule of the empire, while opposing special policies for local people and demanding fair trade and free markets. In fact, the Vienna court also gave Bohemians and Moravians quite favorable conditions, such as selecting a group of officials, including civil servants and military attaches, from the two places every year, and the right to limit land prices. At that time, Austria was not called Czechs. The term Czechs began to appear in official documents after 1848. Imperial law stipulates that non-local ethnic groups need to pay an additional 150% price limit tax when purchasing land. This was mainly used to prevent German princes from annexing land in Bohemia, which would lead to a recurrence of the Hussite uprising. The Hussite rebellion was actually a rebellion in which the German nobles went to Bohemia to annex land wantonly, which ultimately led to the people's desperation. This was also one of the heaviest losses suffered by Austria in its history. The domestic economy almost stagnated for 20 years. The number of troops lost exceeded 100,000, and the Vienna court did not dare to raise taxes on the Czech region for hundreds of years. Guess who broke this rule later? That's right, it was our great Joseph II, the only emperor who could force the entire empire to rebel. However, the current Czechs are actually highly Germanized, just like the Irish in later generations. Almost no Czech people around the city speak Czech. Only in impoverished mountainous areas, in the countryside, and in universities, are people often communicating in Czech. The best way to irritate a local Bohemian noble at this time is to communicate with him in Czech, so that he will think that you think he is a low-class person. From the perspective of the imperial government, both forces are seeking death, so the intensity of the strikes is about the same. Historically, Austria did not take any substantive measures and only issued several imperial edicts to appease the people. However, now that the Austrian Empire's pockets are bulging and its prestige has been accumulating, it will naturally attack these guys who may cause turmoil in the country. But what Prime Minister Metternich did not expect was that the so-called Czech nationalism and German nationalism were not created by college students and professors. Behind the two are two huge interest groups. It was not until Franz killed the Winster family that Czech nationalism reached a low ebb. Of course, the unexpected death of Viscount Hilberin also dealt a heavy blow to German nationalism. Therefore, the two sides are generally evenly matched. Occasionally, radicals from both sides are caught by the secret police. These restless guys will even hold unlimited fighting competitions in prison. Franz knew very well that all this was just a preview of the Spring of Nations 4 years later, but changes in history had also changed the balance of power among the three parties. Prague at this time became the center of exchanges between Lusitania and the German region. The influx of large numbers of German immigrants greatly changed the structure of the local population. However, there are actually not many people who really want to overthrow the Habsburgs, which is quite gratifying for the future prince. But the problem is that the historical Czech national movement was not originally aimed at overthrowing the empire. After all, intelligence will naturally decrease when people gather together, and they can easily be exploited. So Franz must find a way to curb this trend, but unless forced, he will not choose to fight fire with German nationalism. At this time, the only Czech political, economic, military, and academic leader was Marshal Radetzky. However, the old marshal had no interest in pursuing independence. On the contrary, he was very opposed to it. Firstly, Radetzky was an imperial soldier, and secondly, he was proud to be a member of the Austrian nobility. The most important thing is that, whether from the perspective of a weather-beaten old man or a soldier, Radetzky feels that Bohemian independence is nonsense, and will neither succeed nor be possible. The large number of German immigrants entering Bohemia did bring about a series of thorny problems, but it was actually a good thing for the local nobles and businessmen, because labor costs dropped. It is also beneficial to small shopkeepers and property-owning farmers, because a large number of immigrants and outsiders stimulate local consumption. At the same time, because the empire is on the rise, the vast majority of residents actually feel that life is better than before. Of course, not everyone agrees with this view. For example, some local overlords have lost their control over Bohemia due to population growth and a large number of German immigrants, especially after Winster was killed by Franz. The government began to liquidate them. Although each of these guys claimed to have thousands of troops, when the farmers and a few mercenaries actually saw the regular army, they ran faster than rabbits. However, Czech nationalist interest groups still thought of a way to counterattack the Vienna court, which was to demand the compilation of local history. In fact, due to historical reasons, almost every province in the empire can compile its own local history. This is reasonable, but they internally introduced Palacky, a radical professor, who openly opposed Habsburg rule more than once in the university, and was a fanatical admirer of Huss. In his writing, the Austrians are like clowns, robbers who have stolen the ancestral homeland of the Czechs. However, someone soon pointed out that the Germans had lived in Bohemia since ancient times, and that the Czechs, who were West Slavs, were the foreign invaders. This made German nationalists so angry that they even surrounded the historian's house until the army was dispatched to drive the crowd away. Later, the University of Prague, under strong pressure from public opinion, had to expel the troubling professor on the grounds of academic misconduct. Words such as thief and liar were written all over the door of Palacky's house, which was unacceptable for a proud and arrogant professor. He angrily came to the local gendarmerie headquarters and demanded severe punishment for the thugs, but the only answers he received were, "Who are the thugs? Who are the thugs?" Chapter 487 Great Hungary. It is also an area hardest hit by nationalism, but the Hungarian side appears to be much quieter. After all, their previous series of death-defying operations have severely damaged their vitality. The common people did not trust the local council, and the serfs were eager to run to the Habsburg family immediately, and it was impossible for the German immigrants to side with the Hungarian nobles. Even relying on foreign powers has become difficult because of the change of ownership in Belgrade. In fact, the best way to attack Austria from the Ottomans is Serbia, but at this time, Belgrade, which is the throat, is already Austrian territory. Moreover, Austria has never stopped reinforcing this place after acquiring it. After all, the key to the Balkans is a battleground for military strategists. Historically, the competition between Austria and the Ottomans over Belgrade has almost never stopped. If you want to break this cycle, you must change your strategy. Point as far as the locals in Belgrade were concerned, they did not object to Vienna's rule, because they were greatly enriched materially. Point at the same time, due to the two immigration policies of Serbia and Austria, real locals have become extremely rare. Point the Germans and Croatians who migrated in large numbers grew up listening to stories that demonized the Ottomans. And the Italians, descendants of Rome, also had a bad impression of these Near Eastern barbarians. At least the mass base for the Ottomans to want to rule Belgrade disappeared. Coupled with religious conflicts, the cost of fighting a security war was also very high. Point however, Franz did not think that such a situation would happen again. After all, the empire invested a lot of materials in the construction of this city and concentrated a large number of troops to defend it, so it would be extremely difficult for the Ottomans alone to break through. Point it is inevitable that Hungary's technological and economic development has almost stagnated because they chose to derail from Austria, thereby losing their vast market and the driving force for innovation. Point the only eye-catching technology is the roller grinding method, but in fact this is not something worthy of praise. After all, it has appeared in the East hundreds of years ago. Point due to its slow technical content, Austria was able to reproduce it without much effort and also upgraded it. Point when the Hungarians wanted to obtain Austrian technology, it was very difficult, whether it was high-end analytical machines or low-end vulcanized rubber technology. As for their steam machinery, they were still at the level of 20 years ago. Point because Franz asked Mrs. Sophie to openly bribe a large number of Magyar nobles, the division within Hungary was much more serious than in history. Point the moderate reformists that HNIE failed to establish some time ago are now a force that cannot be ignored, although they still cannot compete with the radical liberals in Kossuth. Point moreover, SYNOPSIS also changed his position, no longer advocating national independence, but instead advocating integration and co-prosperity, saying that the latter's approach was to push Hungary to the grave. Point but what the Hungarian nobles want is more rights. Even if they do not increase or decrease, they must at least protect the rights in their hands without losing them, so Kossuth still has many supporters. In 1844, the Hungarian parliament officially passed a resolution establishing Hungarian as the national language of the kingdom. Any official documents, contracts, and legal clauses must be written in it, otherwise they will be deemed invalid. Point at the same time, it was stipulated that ethnic minorities must learn Hungarian, and books and newspapers published in ethnic minority languages were prohibited. Die Ferenc Kossuth even declared Egyország, Egynemzet. Point this sentence is not like Chinese, which can be played with the spring and autumn period, and derive many meanings. Based on the background of the times and the actual situation, there is only one explanation, and that is there are only Magyars in the Kingdom of Hungary. This decree immediately aroused dissatisfaction among all ethnic minorities, including gypsies. After all, 2/3 of the St. Stephen's Crown territory were ethnic minorities. In fact, the translation as ethnic minorities is not accurate, and foreign ethnic groups is more appropriate. This title better reflects the Magyar people's sense of superiority and contempt for other groups at that time. Point the Kingdom of Hungary carried out some reforms after the Napoleonic War, but the results were not satisfactory, especially after Austria joined the German customs union. The market shrank, and economic development tended to regress. In fact, Hungary still has a group of pioneers who established breweries, sugar mills, steel mills, textile mills, and steam machinery manufacturing plants. However, because the neighbors next door developed too fast, they could only enclose the land for their own enjoyment, which resulted in their products being uncompetitive. Those pioneers quickly died on the road, while the latecomers clung to the policies and the thighs of monopoly. Point Hungarians complain about low quality and expensive goods, but high quality goods cannot come in, so they can only choose to swallow their anger, but foreigners will not buy it. Hungarian industrial products shipped to Trieste often have to be shipped back intact, because compared with Austrian products that transcend their times, they are no different from garbage. Point of course, the Magyars also understood that their industry would not be able to develop if this continued. Point as a result, an almost harsh protection regulation was born. Anyone who had no choice but to bring any Austrian goods back to Hungary in any form would be fined the equivalent of 500 florins. In severe cases, all property would be confiscated, or even sentenced to hanging. This outrageous decree immediately aroused dissatisfaction in Vienna as soon as it was promulgated, because this is equivalent to acknowledging the fact that it is illegal for an Austrian to wear his own clothes to Hungary. In fact, before the Austrians could react, the Hungarian frontier troops had already begun to deal with the passing merchants. In the eyes of this group of people, there is no difference between Austrians and Hungarians. They only see fat sheep. In less than a month, many important figures were murdered. This included the family of Anselm Rothschild, the eldest son of Solomon Rothschild. Anselm was fearful of his father, but disdainful of anyone else. A group of border bastards blocking the road were naturally not taken seriously by the eldest son of His Majesty the King. But as a big man and businessman, he won't waste time with these ants. So Anselm asked the coachman to get 10 groschen to prepare, but the soldier sitting on the wooden fence of the checkpoint knocked the copper coins to the ground. "You want to send us brothers away with just a few coppers? I tell you today, listen carefully, for 100 florins, or I will send you to prison." 100 florins? The coachman's eyes widened. To be honest, it's not like he has never seen the world before, but asking for 100 florins to pass the checkpoint is a bit exaggerated. He usually only charges a few florins. You must know that there are dozens of checkpoints from here to the Austro-Hungarian border, and 100 florins is enough for a family of 3 to spend for a year. Anselm also doubted his ears. He felt that he might have encountered a robber. After all, this was not uncommon in Hungary. It was not surprising, even if these people were wearing uniforms at this time. After all, there was no surveillance at this time. Anselm winked at his bodyguard, who immediately got out of the car and argued with the sentry at the checkpoint. But soon the two sides started fighting. Soon Anselm was imprisoned. Solomon found Metternich, and the matter completely escalated. Chapter 488. To be honest, the relationship between Hungarian senior officials and the Rothschild family is good, but the Hungarians don't know this, let alone the sentries who randomly set up checkpoints on the border. Anselm's bodyguard, Boris Vincent, thought that he could scare him by mentioning the name of the Rothschild family. It turned out that these sentries were all great Hungarians who had been brainwashed by Kossuth. Not to mention Jewish financiers. Even if the Emperor of Austria was here, they would peel off their skins. Bah! How dare you order me, Jewish lackey? The Hungarian sentry couldn't help but became furious after hearing Boris's introduction. "I won't talk to you, so call your commander out." "Can't I cure you?" Boris Vincent's bossy look would even make people suspect that he is Anselm Rothschild. This is actually quite normal, a 7th rank official in front of the Prime Minister, not to mention the bodyguard of His Majesty the King's son. In fact, this Boris Vincent was very experienced, and he immediately pinched the opponent's pulse, because this level was privately set up. If this matter is really pursued, these sentinels will be miserable. But he overlooked one problem, that is, this is not a city, but a wilderness. Even if there are pedestrians on the road, no one dares to care about the military affairs. The leader of the sentry on the side put down half the sweet potato in his hand, picked up a stick, and walked towards Boris Vincent. "Who are you going to kill?" the sentry leader said angrily, and at the same time he picked up the stick in his hand and stabbed the bodyguard in the stomach. This time, he didn't hold back. If he was hit, he would have to break a few ribs. How could someone who might be appreciated by the Rothschild family be a loser? I saw Boris giving in, grabbing, and twisting his backhand to subdue the arrogant sentry leader, but before he could be proud, he was hit on the back of the head with a stick and blood started to flow. Boris was beaten and staggered forward a few steps, then turned around and punched the sentry who sneaked up on him in the face. The latter flew backwards, and when he struggled to get up, he was stepped on by the former in the chest. Boris took out a pistol from his body, pointed at the sentry at his feet and said, "Get out of here, or I'll kill you now." Then, a gunshot was heard, and the white village shirt under Boris's vest turned bright red. The 3 sentries then stabbed the corpse dozens of times. The coachman and Anselm next to him were frightened. Murder was no stranger to them, but they couldn't help but feel a wave of anger when they saw the tragic death of someone they knew. Nausea. The 3 sentries were originally just looking for money, and they were killed out of urgency. Even if you kill all the people in the car and take away the property, you can just run away. But they were afraid of having a bad conscience, so they arrested Anselm and the coachman and sent them to the gendarmerie on charges of smuggling goods and committing murder with a gunpoint. These 3 people were not punished after they returned. Instead, they were awarded. After all, no fat sheep had been turned in since the implementation of this law. When Anselm saw the bodyguard being killed, he took it for granted that the matter was not that simple, but his ability to adapt to changes was really not very good. In the end, he was sent to prison like a piece of wood. The coachman was beaten half to death because he lied about being a Magyar originally. If the matter ended here, it would not cause any big problems. Just return Anselm and deal with some of the people who need to be dealt with, and that should be the end of it. But by chance, Anselm met a great Magyarist who was not afraid of the reputation of the Rothschild family. On the contrary, he thought it was a good opportunity to show the world the strength of the Magyar people. So Anselm was tied to a cross and poked in the center of the road. A sign hung around his neck said, "You must pay taxes according to law when you pass the card. My name is Anselm Rothschild, and I'm a Jew, a lackey of the Austrians." Although Anselm Rothschild was Jewish, he had the status of an Austrian noble. The news soon spread to Buda and Pest. Although the Hungarian leaders wanted to send Anselm back, they were opposed by the Magyarists because the latter felt that the local magistrate had done the right thing, and anyone who violated the law in Hungary needed to be dealt with in the Hungarian way, and neither Austrians nor Jews should be exceptions. The former was forced to order commendations for the sentries and officials who arrested Anselm, which greatly stimulated the Magyarists. A group of literati and historians under Kossuth told the old story again. The Magyars are the descendants of the Huns. Among the Huns, only slaves were engaged in production. The real warriors should rob and rape. As a result, many ordinary people have been infected by this emotion and joined the army of slaughtering fat sheep. However, the 3 commended sentinels suddenly disappeared. This was not an assassination or conspiracy, but that these people felt danger. Matthew and Dan were originally serfs of a certain landowner. When the horse bandits broke out in Hungary, the landlord unfortunately died. Matthew, Dan and other serfs rushed into the master's house and burned all the contracts, documents and other paper items they could find. But in the end they became someone else's serfs, and the new master was even more vicious. The 2 of them couldn't bear it and ran away to join the temporarily established Magyar People's Army. The 2 of them never expected that the person they randomly caught would cause an uproar. When Solomon Rothschild learned about this, his lungs almost exploded with anger. He was angry not because of the audacity of the Hungarians, but because of the stupidity and arrogance of his eldest son. He knew that the land route from Hungary to Austria was difficult and unsafe because of the many checkpoints, but he insisted on going and only brought 1 bodyguard with him. That Boris was also a fool and deserved to die in Hungary. But this is a good thing for Solomon. After all, both Austria and Hungary are wooing him. Anselm also went there to discuss business this time. Hungary wanted to develop its own industry, but it had neither technology nor money, and the Rothschild family happened to have both. Moreover, because Solomon suffered repeated defeats on the Austrian side, he planned to switch to another Ming emperor. So the 2 parties connected easily with the help of the broker. From Anselm's experience, he knew that the negotiations must have broken down. However, in Solomon's opinion, it would be good to exchange a useless life for a certificate of nomination to reconcile with Austria. Solomon found Metternich as an old friend who was shocked by the former's tired old age. But the European Prime Minister is a European Prime Minister after all. He has seen too many people and things, and too many conspiracies and tricks. How can he be fooled by mere tricks? Your Majesty Prime Minister, Anselm was captured by the Magyars and they insulted him. In order that my family will never suffer such humiliation in the future, I'm willing to serve the empire. Solomon spoke sincerely, but Metternich knew that he was talking about business. The latter did not like the former, but Austria did need money at this time. Don't worry, old friend. Anselm will be fine. We are doing our best to solve this matter. In addition, the royal family is planning to open a new batch of factories in Bohemia. I wonder if you are interested? Chapter 489, St. Stephen's Crown Line. Vienna, Chancellery point. Although the two old foxes kept talking about Anselm, no one cared about the life and death of the plutocrat point. The so-called factories in Bohemia were actually a group of mines. The mining industry at that time was a high-risk industry, and of course the profits were very generous, but the problem is that it's high stakes and has a bad reputation, often dealing with difficult problems. In fact, Franz once imagined using prisoners to replace laborers in the mines. The reality is that it is very easy for these people to get together to riot, blow up the mines, and kill their companions in endless cases, but the most important point is inefficiency. These people have neither the skills nor the desire to complete the work itself. Points due to the rapid development of industry in the Austrian Empire, a large amount of ore and coal were needed at this time, and these prisoners were obviously not enough. Point there are many mines in the mountains of the Austrian Empire, but the output is seriously insufficient, so new mines must be opened. But if it is directly operated by the royal family, it will inevitably cause a lot of problems, and will also get a bad reputation. Point it is naturally better to let others do this kind of thing. At this time, Metternich mentioned it to Solomon because he wanted him to take the blame. Point this is indeed a big business, which can bring a lot of profits to Solomon, and at the same time, it can also solve the urgent problems of Austrian industrial development. Point, but doing so will undoubtedly promote to the outside world that the Rothschild family is just the lackeys of the Habsburg family, and will be under a lot of pressure from all sides, which will also affect his reputation. Point Solomon felt that Metternich still hated him for using the debt problem to blackmail the latter, so the former did not directly agree to the proposal. Point on the other hand, Hungary's industrial protection law has caused public outrage. Nobles and businessmen continued to claim that they had been robbed in Hungary and asked the Austrian Imperial government for an explanation. Point the humiliating punishment suffered by Anselm Rothschild ignited the anger of other ethnic groups in the Austrian Empire. Point this is not because the Rothschild family is very popular, but because everyone needs a breakthrough. Point seeing that the fire was almost burning, Franz proposed to Prime Minister Metternich to abolish the industrial protection law unilaterally enacted by Hungary. Point this seems very reasonable to Metternich, and the Hungarian side must be willing to accept it. Point, but what he said next made him break out in a cold sweat. Prime Minister, we should renegotiate tax rates with Hungary. Franz had been waiting for this day for a long time. In fact, he thought it would be longer, but he didn't expect that the Hungarians would do so much. Point in fact, in history, the Hungarians also enacted a very strict industrial protection law, such as imposing heavy taxes on imported goods and establishing protective associations to supervise everyone. Both nobles and commoners must purchase expensive and inferior Hungarian goods, but it didn't make any waves at the time, because Austria's industry was also very weak and there was nothing to dump. Point at this time, Metternich smelled a hint of danger. The kingdom's local taxes were the lifeblood of the Hungarian parliament. They had the courage to challenge the central government of the Austrian Empire. Because of this, Archduke Franz, I know that you will be a very ambitious monarch, but please wait a moment, and don't act too hastily. The former Joseph II was also an ideal king, but in the end he only got the support of the people. Betray. Franz naturally understood what the other party meant, but from several incidents, it seemed that Hungary was rotten to the core. To cure it, he had to cut out the flesh and drain the pus, remove the decay, and regenerate muscle. Point of course, Franz would not cut off the strength of a strong man and force Austria to withdraw from the historical stage of hegemony. Your Majesty Prime Minister, we cannot act too hastily, but we cannot let things go. Today Hungarians want to protect industry, but tomorrow they may want to protect agriculture. The lives of the Magyars are lives, but the lives of other ethnic groups in our country are not lives either. Archduke Franz, you have misunderstood me. We can severely reprimand and warn them. If Hungary enacts such outrageous laws again, it will be punished by the empire, so, as long as it's not outrageous, they can continue to make new laws. Franz asked rhetorically, but this is tradition. The Austrian imperial government still needs the approval of the Regency Council when enacting laws, but the Hungarians can enact a law, as long as it is not too outrageous. What is the reason? If a civil war breaks out between Austria and Hungary one day, which side will those weak forces take? Metternich was at a loss for words. He didn't know how to answer because his idea was always to prevent the civil war from happening. God bless Austria, Archduke Franz. Why do you have such an idea? Metternich's words seemed weak, but in fact they were extremely tough. He was questioning Franz. Prime Minister, do you remember the previous crisis? The war may not be as far away as you thought. The latter did not flinch, but instead insinuated the Austrian Imperial government's embarrassing performance in the face of crisis. If Franz had not taken advantage of the situation in the previous crisis, the reputation of the Austrian Empire would have been ruined long ago. Metternich frowned. Archduke Franz, if you feel that the power of the Parliament of the Kingdom of Hungary is too great, shouldn't you directly limit their power? Why renegotiate the tax rate instead of the law? Your Majesty Prime Minister, the kingdom's finances and taxes are where their courage lies. As long as they have money and food, the 12 million people in Hungary are their soldiers. If they want weapons, merchants will find ways to send them to them. Therefore, their power must be weakened. Metternich nodded with relief. He knew that his student was no ordinary person, but to be honest, he had nothing to do with the Hungarian problem. Every time, the Hungarian nobles could only be frightened by liberating the serfs, but Kossuth, who had just come to power, did the opposite. He actually inherited Szécheny's mantle and demanded the initiative to abolish serfdom. This new enemy made Vienna. The government is terrified. Archduke Franz, what are you going to do? If you just negotiate tax rates, the Hungarians will not agree to policies that are unfavorable to them. My Lord Prime Minister, there have never been only Magyars in the territory of St. Stephen's Crown. There are also Illyrians, Transylvanians and Ruthenians. Strictly speaking, the so-called Kingdom of Hungary should only be Central Hungary. It's just that area. After listening to Franz's words, Metternich couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat, because if only Central Hungary was left, it would be a quarter of its original territory, which would be very easy to control. But the Magyars would not agree. Metternich said subconsciously, yes, but if any one of the Illyrians, Transylvanians, and Galicians agrees, that's our victory. Mr. Prime Minister, I also want to tell you some good news. That is the opening of the St. Stephen's Crown line. Metternich suddenly realized that the railway was really a good thing. It could project Austria's power to farther areas faster. Although there is no railway in Hungary, the military built a railway around St. Stephen's Crown on the border of the Kingdom of Hungary under the pretext of supporting Belgrade and homeland defense. Illyrians are the collective name for Slovenians, Croatians, and Serbs. Chapter 490 Miners. Solomon was unwilling to take over the mining plant in Bohemia because he naturally wanted to wait for the government to make concessions, but Franz did not want to wait, and Austria's industrial development could not afford to wait. A banker named Archias showed great interest in this. Although his financial resources were less than 1/10 of Solomon's, there seemed to be no better candidate than him. 8 His bank is one of the top 10 banks in Vienna, ranked at the bottom. At the same time, this banker is a Jew who converted to Catholicism. It can be said that he has the attributes of taking the blame. I'm afraid that no Jews will stand by him. This side point, but what Franz and the Austrian Empire need at this time is this kind of person. It is impossible to do it quickly and well without having to bear any karma. Of course, as far as Franz is concerned, there is no reason to give up before trying. The first was to ban small coal kilns. At that time, small coal kilns did not have the possibility of safety hazards, but there was some safety in the danger. There are almost no protective measures. Miners can only bring their own canaries to judge whether there is danger. Mining tools can only be purchased by themselves. What is even more frightening is that you need to rely on ladders or ropes to enter and exit the mine. That's right. A person has to carry a wicker basket and load it with more than 100 kilograms of ore, and then climb up a ladder more than 20 meters long, or wrap himself and the basket with a winch, and let the man above turn the winch to pull him. Go up. Adults can only bend down to pass through the narrow alleys, so a large number of child laborers have been created. It is said that 40% of miners in this era will die or lose the ability to work in the first year. After that, another 40% were eliminated in the second year, and the same was true in the third year. By the beginning of the 4th year, only 6.4% were still alive. This is still a relatively formal big mine, and the small kiln without records is really unimaginable. There is a legend that whenever a child worker dies in a mine, his body is buried near the mine, and a small flower is planted. Therefore, when people see flowers all over the mountains and fields near the mining factory, they should not admire the majesty of nature, but should be in awe of the dead under the flowers. And in addition to safety, the efficiency of small kilns is also very low. The Austrian Empire's industry is developing rapidly, and relying only on people's backs and pickaxes will definitely not work. Only people as the driving force will eventually be eliminated. The first thing Franz had to solve was the access problem, which was the lift. Since Babbage could build an elevator seat several meters high, it would not be difficult to build an elevator more than 10 meters high. In fact, there are already steam elevators in this era, but this thing is still a bit too backward, and it is also extremely dangerous. The UK has a more advanced method of using it, but it has not yet spread to continental Europe. This simple machine is still preserved in some mineral museums in Germany and Poland. It is 2 huge wooden stakes with handrails and hooks on them. It is actually an embedded steel nail. The steam machine above will drive the wooden piles to move. All the person has to do is to hold onto the handrails and fix his body to move with the wooden piles until he reaches the position he wants to reach, and then jump off the wooden piles by himself. The so-called mineral museum is actually an abandoned mining area. In fact, the local people call it mine tourism. Based on the above description, book friends may not be able to understand its danger. In fact, this kind of machinery was not under human control at the time, and the steam machine would run continuously. And except for the bottom floor, there is actually a distance between each floor and the wooden piles. You need to jump up and down. If you are not careful, you will find a pit more than 10 meters deep. If you fall down, you can imagine the consequences. The elevators used in mines are not very complicated. Historically, they had been used by the British in 1851, before they were launched at the World Expo. Experts from the Royal Academy of Sciences in Vienna quickly came up with several solutions. In the end, Franz chose a hydraulic lift because it was most in line with historical trends, and Austria leads the world in hydraulic technology. Then there are the mine tracks. Now Austria's steel production is rising, but production without consumption is not enough. In the past, due to cost issues, few people would choose to lay rails in the mine tunnel. After all, labor costs were so cheap. But now Austria's iron and steel making technology has developed by leaps and bounds. The increase in output has led to a shortage of raw materials and a rise in mineral prices, so anything that can improve production efficiency is desirable. And while improving production efficiency, it can also reduce the suffering of those miners at the same time. A large number of safety lamps and helmets have also been developed. These items can be rented to miners in mining areas, and can also increase their probability of survival. Moreover, the safety lamp developed by experts from the Royal Academy of Sciences is obviously stronger than the latest invention of the British Dias safety lamp. These discovered that the flame could not pass through the small holes in the fine gauze, which meant that the flame inside the gauze could not ignite the gases in the atmosphere outside the lamp. This was one of the most famous scientists of his time, and his invention became the basis for most subsequent flame safety lamps later. Other European countries followed suit and developed a large number of types of safety lights, but in the wrong direction. They only studied how to make the lights brighter and cheaper, not safer. In fact, after the widespread use of safety lights around 1860, the probability of explosions did decrease, but mining accidents involving hundreds of people that shocked the world occurred several times every year at that time. A gas inspector job was also created. He usually put himself in a sack filled with water, and then used a long stick with a burning candle attached to it to explore the mine. If there is no explosion, it proves that the mine is safe. The opposite is dangerous. This method is good, but a bit useless. Naturally, everyone at the Royal Academy of Sciences in Vienna will not play with such low-end products, and with Franz taking charge of the general direction, the real safety of safety lights comes from early warning. As a result, the Austrian version of the Klaus hydrogen lamp was born at this time. The biggest feature of this safety lamp is that it will suddenly brighten as a warning once it encounters methane. The price is relatively high, but miners praise it very much and would rather rent this kind of safety lamp at a high price than buy other types of safety lamps produced in other countries at a low price point. After all, no one wants to die if they can live. The emergence of this new type of safety light has caused Austria's mining accidents to plummet. After all, at this time, most miners in neighboring countries did not even know what a safety light was. At the same time, various mining machinery such as splitters, excavators, and cut-off machines are also being continuously developed. After all, before 1860, the only tools used for mining around the world were picks and shovels. Franz's heavy investment in the extractive industry brought huge rewards to the Austrian Empire in the future. In fact, there are many mining universities in the Austrian Empire, but the teaching materials in these universities are still used by the British decades ago, so no matter what kind of talents they absorb, what they teach are stupid ass and Trojan horses. Franz naturally would not let this happen again. Under his promotion, the University of Mining and Technology carried out comprehensive rectification and listed practice as one of its most important assessment items. Instead of becoming a scapegoat for the Austrian Empire, banker Attius turned into a mining tycoon. Chapter 491. Britain at that time. On the other side of the ocean, the world's most powerful country at this time, the British Empire. Unlike fellow workers in the city, who had to sleep in coffins and hang ropes, the miners' bedrooms were obviously much larger. David woke up in a narrow and cramped old alley. The clothes covering his body were already full of patches. This was thanks to his mother. After all, everyone else in the alley was wearing clothes with holes. Thinking of this, David felt a little proud when a scream came from the entrance of the alley, coming from a girl. She was a beautiful little girl with a brown ponytail. Since she was the youngest and a girl, the other child workers gave her the best pile of straw at the entrance of the alley. It's just after 5 o'clock and I don't know why the supervisor was so crazy to come to work so early today. David complained to the child workers around him while putting on his ragged clothes. We didn't get off work until 8 o'clock last night. These damn guys took it out on us. If they couldn't recruit workers, Jim cursed, then grabbed a cup and drank the turbid liquid in it, and then choked out a few pebbles from his nose. Go over and take a look. Kate is only 7 years old. That black-hearted guy with a big nose doesn't attack lightly or harshly. Don't hurt anyone. After saying that, the 2.5 boys ran towards the entrance of the cave. In fact, in order to prevent the child workers from dozing off, the supervisors usually grab the boy or girl's head and press it directly into the sink until the devils are satisfied. This trick usually keeps people awake for a whole day, but occasionally accidents happen. That is, they can't sleep at all. This was during the British miners' strike. On March 31, 1844, Britain's largest coal company required all miners to sign new contracts on the grounds that the old contracts had expired. But before this group of capitalists proposed a new contract, the miners proposed a new contract of their own. The content is as follows. 1. Wages are calculated based on weight instead of volume. 2. When weighing, use ordinary scales and weights that have been inspected by government prosecutors. 3. The employment period is half a year. 4. Abolish the fine system and pay wages according to the type of work actually done. 5. The mine owner has the obligation to ensure that workers who work exclusively for him work at least 4 days a week, or to ensure that they receive wages for 4 days a week. These terms may seem of little significance to modern eyes, but the situation faced by British miners at that time was that coal was sold by weight, but workers were paid by volume. But the reality is that coal is solid rather than liquid. So it is difficult to tell whether the barrel is full or not. According to the regulations at the mine at the time, if the bucket was not completely filled, he would not get any salary at all, but if he filled it more, he would not get a penny more. At the same time, if the amount of sand in the mining barrel exceeds a certain amount, the industry will not only not receive wages, but will also be fined for cheating the foreman. However, the amount of sand in a coal mine is not determined by the miners, but usually depends on the depth of the coal seam. At that time, there were no explicit provisions on fines. The amount of fines and the fines depended entirely on the whims and conscience of the supervisors and bosses. Therefore, no one dares to offend the supervisor, because once he offends a supervisor, not only will he not get paid, but he will even have to pay a fine to the company. As for why it is necessary to use scales and weights that have been inspected by government prosecutors when weighing, the reason is also very simple. Kwajin Shaoling is not only found in the East. Westerners play it even better. Those who are more conscientious use leaders' weights, while those who are unscrupulous simply use a 10 kg weight as a 5 kg weight. At that time, there was a strange law in the UK, which was that, if a worker wanted to accuse the mining factory of inaccurate weights, he had to report it 3 weeks in advance. This kind of protection for enterprises can be described as meticulous. Why is Article 3 half a year? This has something to do with France, because there are always economic crises in the UK, and coal sales are divided into off-season and peak seasons, so mines will sign 1-year contracts in order to have labour at any time. At that time, British law stipulated that workers were not allowed to leave their posts without authorization during their employment, otherwise they would have to compensate the employer for losses and be imprisoned for 5 to 6 weeks. But those coal mine owners will not pay workers during non-working hours, which means that once the mines stop production during an economic downturn, the miners can only drink the northwest wind and are not allowed to find other jobs to make ends meet. Otherwise they will have to compensate the boss for his losses, and in order to control the miners, usually the bosses will withhold wages from 1 week to half a year. As for taking the legal approach, generally speaking, the mine owners are the local parliamentarians or even the Speaker of the House. The officials who handle these matters are either their relatives or friends. Even if they are not relatives, they can become relatives and friends. After all, this is considered a strong alliance. Articles 4 and 5 are also intended to restrict mine owners from deducting wages from miners and prevent them from taking advantage of legal loopholes. Naturally, the mine owners would not accept these conditions, but this time the fuss was a bit big. On the first day alone, 40,000 miners laid down their hoes and picks, followed by 60,000 in Manchester, and the news even reached Robert Peel. In the Prime Minister's ears, of course, these mine owners also thought of other methods, such as replacing child labor. You must know that there are a large number of children in the workhouses, and the price is low, and there are street children everywhere in London. In fact, although British law has explicitly prohibited the use of child labor since 1842, in fact the problem of child labor still exists widely in British society. At this time, these children in the tunnel were child workers in the mine. And the supervisor was naturally angry because he could not meet the targets above. Kate was sold into the mines by her drunkard father because she was too young and a girl. Her only task was to clean the wind tunnel. She had to crawl into a hole less than a meter in diameter and clean it of dust and debris while preventing water and mud from blocking it. To overcome the fear of repeating simple movements for more than 10 hours in the dark, Kate sings a song her mother sang when she was still alive. The girls singing echoed in the alley, which made these child workers feel the same. So some people were willing to give her the softest and most comfortable haystack. Because that song is their light in the darkness. At this moment, the girl named Kate was too slow to get dressed, so the supervisor Big Nose grabbed her ponytail and dragged her out of bed naked. The supervisor raised the cat's claw whip, a whip made of several hemp ropes, in his hand and shouted harshly, "Damn, little thing. You can't even put on your clothes, so don't wear them. You'll be a bitch when you grow up." Big Nose got more and more aggressive as he scolded her. I don't know if it was because he used too much force or because the girl's body was too fragile. With a tearing sound, the supervisor actually tore off the ponytail and all the flesh. Big Nose looked at the hair and flesh in his hand, threw it away, and then spat on Kate. "What are you looking at? Why don't you go to work? Don't you want to live anymore? I tell you, each of you has 24 cars today. If you miss one car, you won't be able to eat." At this time, the supervisor was hit hard on the back of his head, and he subconsciously reached out to touch it, which was already dripping with blood. Big Nose immediately became angry. He discovered that the murder weapon was a stone that could be seen everywhere, but he could not find the murderer. Who did it? Didn't you hear it? Tell me. You are a bunch of rubbish. Pigs no one wants. The supervisor waved the whip in his hand and beat the child workers in front of him desperately. At this time, someone picked up a stone and threw it at the overseer's head. He turned around and finally found the murderer, the boy named David. David, you won't survive today. And your deformed mother, you all must die. The overseer brandished his whip and rushed towards the boy, but he tripped and fell to the ground. When he looked up and wanted to get up, he saw the tall and thin David standing in front of him holding a big stone. You dare. Before the supervisor could finish his words, he was hit in the head by the big stone. Then a second stone flew towards him, then a third and a fourth, until he stopped struggling. Chapter 490. To the sound of the waves remains. The British miners' strike had a much greater impact than in history. After all, Great Britain was firmly ranked first in the world at the time. At this time, Austria and France had become strong competitors. What was even more frightening was that both countries had their own circles. This made Robert Peel, an advocate of free trade, unable to start. Although the several civil strifes that broke out in the UK did not lead to a revolution, they severely damaged its vitality. If the Far East had not been providing blood transfusions to the country, the situation would have been unmanageable. Although the situation in South America has opened up, it will take some time to really benefit. However, what Robert Peel did not expect was that Paraguay's guerrillas had received support from France, and Brazil, with the support of Austria, promised to provide them with asylum. The British are locked in another Afghan war mine. In Lancashire, England. The child workers still went to work as usual, and even the injured little girl was simply bandaged and put on a hat before coming to the mine. As for the absence of the big-nose overseer, no one noticed, and no one cared about this rotten gambler. The foreman gave each child worker a small bronze medal before going into the mine, so that he could know how many had gone to the mine and how many had returned. Here we mainly rely on cages and hanging baskets to go deep into the mines. The taller ones sit in cages, while the thin ones are placed in hanging baskets. However, whether the former or the latter relied on power at this time, people still turned the windlass, or animals pulled the winches. The so-called cage is a prototype of the modern elevator. There are several iron chains inside a large iron cage, but there is no seal on the outside. People must hold onto the chains to hold the cage when riding this kind of lifting tool, otherwise the violent bumps may make you fly out, which can kill you. Due to the unstable power, the descending speed of this cage is also extremely unstable, and sometimes it even gives people the feeling of falling straight into hell. Of course, sometimes if the intensity is not controlled well, it will indeed send people to hell. Historically, Americans invented the first steam-powered winch in 1850, and British mines only began to equip it around 1860. In addition, at this time, the Industrial Revolution on the European continent had just started, and the Bohemian area was mostly open pit coal mines and shallow coal mines, so the speed requirements for lifting tools were not high, but the load requirements were high, so hydraulic steam was used. At this time, coal mines in the UK had been dug 100 meters underground, and it was too expensive to use hydraulic equipment. Sitting in a cage falling at high speed is not a pleasant experience. It is like riding a roller coaster, but the difference is that the height difference of the latter is usually only 10 to 20 meters, and even the most dangerous one in the world is only 52 meters. But the former can easily break through 150 meters when falling rapidly. People will have a strong sense of suffocation. The whole body will be tense, the limbs will be stiff, the body temperature will drop, and the consciousness will be suspended. In addition, due to the sudden change in air pressure, your eardrums will feel as if they have exploded, and you may even experience temporary tinnitus. The child laborers successfully landed on the cage and began their day's work. The air in the alleyway was turbid, and the smell of feces, urine, and domestic garbage mixed together made people nauseous. Not only did David and Jim feel nothing while they were killing, but they just went about their day's work mechanically as usual. Afterward. Usually when the 9 candles burn out, it's time for them to get off work. At that time, one candle could burn for almost 90 minutes, and the time for 9 candles was usually 13 to 14 hours. David and Jim took off their shirts as usual, dug out coals, knocked off the stones, and threw them into the basket point. Although the British spring is very cold, it is very hot and humid below the mine, and the turbid air makes it difficult to breathe. Point just like that, the 9 candles were burned out, and a fat and greasy middle-aged man on the ground asked the foreman, "How much is done?" "About 1/10 of the usual amount." The foreman replied, "Damn it. Let those dirty brats go back to work. The big guys in London are still waiting for our good news. I will not bow to those poor brats." The middle-aged man said angrily, "Boss, these kids have reached their limit. Damn it. Do you want to go against me? If you can't meet the target, you and your people will get out of here and mine." The middle-aged man threatened, "Boss, they have reached their limit. If they continue to work, people will die. Now the workers are on strike. If these children die again, who will dig for you?" The foreman argued. Point this foreman speaks for the child workers, not that he is very sympathetic. If these children died normally, no one would hold them accountable. After all, everyone still has to live, and most people would choose to swallow their anger. But at this juncture, if these children are really dead, there will be someone who will not let them go. Then he, the foreman, must be the boss's scapegoat in the end. After all, no one else will even have the chance to enjoy this on a point. Although British law explicitly prohibits child labor, even if it is employed, the penalties are not severe, but once someone dies, it will be difficult to solve. Point in fact, more than a dozen people have died now. If this matter was reported to the newspaper office, he would probably be jailed and fed as much as he could look for it after it's dead. These living things that no one has raised are everywhere. I know what you are afraid of. I have already taken care of it with a congressman and the newspaper. This matter will never make it to the newspaper. Just feel free and bold. The ground is dry." Upon hearing this, the foreman smiled enthusiastically and adoringly. "Okay, boss, do you know how many ways can I kill someone who disobeys me?" 9 ways. The greasy middle-aged man also showed a long-lost smile. "Go. I'm waiting for your good news. May God be with you." From that day on, the working hours of the child laborers were increased to 10 candles. Buckingham Palace. Prince Albert left England and returned to Germany to handle some family property. This was the first time he was separated from Victoria after her wedding. Point even Victoria was by her side when Prince Albert was shot in the butt, even though the former didn't want his but to be seen at all. Point Victoria, who was bored, had to take her children to ride horses. In order to please Her Majesty the Queen, the palace horseman specially found a pony suitable for children to ride. Point the children had a great time riding the pony, and the Queen herself chatted with Leopold from afar. At this time, King Leopold of Belgium was imprisoned by Louis Philippe in the Hainaut province of the Walloon region. He was grateful to Victoria for allowing him to come out for air, but he also blamed the latter for refusing to send troops to rescue. Point the former is not a political idiot, so he can naturally hear the complaint in his uncle's words. "Uncle, although I'm the Queen of England, I cannot have my own way. But I think those self-righteous fools must regret not rescuing you at this time, and I have dissolved the Whig cabinet. Are you satisfied, King?" Leopold knew that he had to rely on this niece if he wanted to restore his country, so how could he really dare to offend her? Victoria also understands the importance of winning over Belgium, and its restoration will be of great benefit to the country. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 493 White Phosphorus Incendiary Bomb. India. Kolkata. Point compared with the fact that the Austrian army was more popular than the British army, Lieutenant General Raven Hobbeck was even more surprised by another thing. Point the pirates actually attacked the British port and caused hundreds of casualties, which he couldn't believe. No matter what. Point Friedrich found it very interesting. It seemed that his nephew's toy gave them a surprise. Point in fact, pirates were just a secret code. France had already bribed the officials of the British Indian colony They kept silent about Nanming and would only claim that it was piracy. Friedrich certainly knew all this, but he hoped that Britain could fall into the kind of hard battle described by his nephew. After all, the terrain of Kalimantan fully conformed to the characteristics of jungle warfare. Especially when he heard that there was no news about the second batch of reinforcements sent by the British Army. He was even more excited. Franz had been trying his best to avoid fighting in the jungle. Even if he wanted to fight, he had to choose the right time and find a scapegoat. In Guinea, West Africa, several tribes that frequently attacked the Austrians hid in the rainforest. Other tribes also discovered that these outsiders did not dare to go deep into the rainforest to fight. As a result, some tribes that had surrendered boldly began to attack Austrian colonists and farms, and even tried to attack the port. However, now that the main force of the Austrian army has arrived, these attackers were instantly defeated and forced to retreat into the rainforest. They hoped to escape the revenge of the Austrians with the shelter of the rainforest, but this was the driest season before the rainy season in Guinea. In addition, the Austrian side also specially developed a batch of arson weapons for this battle. In fact, it can be seen from the aspect of weapon development that the Austrian skill tree is quite crooked. Franz's original intention was to utilize oil, but this group of unconventional guys actually started researching white phosphorus incendiary bombs directly. The result, of course, was 3 explosions a day, with thick smoke billowing out. The Royal Academy for Women in Vienna had to close for a month and the pollution was huge, so he decided to move this too dangerous project elsewhere. White phosphorus has an extremely low ignition point and is highly toxic. It will produce a large amount of poisonous gas when burned. Although this poisonous gas usually dissipates on its own within 3 minutes, 3 minutes is enough to kill 90% of all living things on the earth. What's even more frightening is that this chemical burns very violently. After it comes into contact with the human body, it will continue to burn until the skin and flesh ulcerate and penetrate deep into the bone marrow. This time usually lasts 5 to 10 minutes, and the injured person will feel hellish pain. What makes Franz most incredible is that this research was actually proposed by a group of missionaries, because when they use this kind of thing every day to play tricks in the colony, they occasionally made mistakes and spilled white phosphorus on other objects or people. And just that small amount of white phosphorus can easily cause unimaginable terrible damage, so they seemed to use it as a weapon, and also gave it a very religious name, Wrath of God. The weapons made by the magic sticks are of course unreliable. Fortunately, these people are very timid and have very little charge, otherwise they might have gone to see God by now. In fact, it was not difficult to make such a weapon using Austrian technology, but Franz felt it was too cruel and was also afraid that other countries would copy it and escalate the intensity of the war, so he temporarily suppressed it and turned to secret research. At the moment, Franz decided to let experts develop petroleum products. After all, this technology could also be used in future civilian technology. A large number of new incendiary rockets flew into the rainforest, and the barriers that blocked the invasion of foreign enemies instantly turned into a sea of fire. The tribes hiding in the rainforest fled frantically, but there was a sea of fire everywhere. The local wizards are not panicked. They claim that, as long as they move deeper into the rainforest, Mother Earth will send down rain to extinguish the fire. Those ferocious black tribes moved towards the depths of the forest with a sense of luck. After all, according to past experience, the fire would be extinguished sooner or later. However, these experienced wizards miscalculated this time. The fire burned continuously for 21 days. 13 million acres of rainforest was reduced to ruins, and all the resistors were reduced to coke. Until the Austrians left, it rained heavily, as if crying for the disaster that was about to happen in this land. Following Franz's instructions, local colonial officials approached the remaining tribal chiefs and told them that they must implement a strict crop rotation system. Those chiefs who were a little arrogant or a little crooked before were scared to death, and their legs were weak even after the Austrian colonial officials left. Almost all the wizards of the tribe received the oracle on the same day. These magic sticks told their tribesmen that the magic of the Austrians is more powerful than ours. Their rule over us is the will of Mother Earth. If you dare to resist, there will be fire from the sky, and the floods descended after a series of wars. Security and production in the African colonies were finally restored. Lieutenant General Raven Hobart did not believe the idiots in British India. What kind of pirates dared to attack the Dutch fleet first and then attack the British port? Now even the reinforcement numbering nearly 5,000 people have lost contact. Damn it. As long as you idiots are around, everything will be like the Afghanistan of the British Empire. Lieutenant General Raven Hobart finally couldn't bear it anymore. He came from the North Sea Fleet and naturally looked down on other no-name troops. In fact, Lieutenant General Raven Hobart was not such an uneducated person. On the contrary, he came from a prominent family, was modest, and was well educated. However, the interactions with his Austrian naval counterparts along the way made him very unhappy. What made him even more disgusted was the appearance of Indian businessmen and colonial officials. So Lieutenant General Raven Hobart became angry. "What did you say, you Scottish bastard?" Lieutenant General Xiun of Calcutta was also very angry. He was already too busy with reinforcement. If that unit really suffered serious losses, then his career would be ruined. At this time, coupled with the other party's unknown fire, Lieutenant General Xiun also broke out. "Who are you calling a bastard? Your mother is a Scottish bitch." As the saying goes, it is easy to hit someone, but not to slap them in the face. After a short while, the two lieutenant generals were pulled away with bruises and swollen faces. In fact, the loss of contact with the British reinforcement also aroused Friedrich's interest. He decided to go to Kalimantan with Lieutenant General Raven Hobart to investigate the pirate incident. In fact, Franz had already bribed British Indian officials, hoping to put an end to this matter in the name of piracy. It's just that Nanming's unilateral actions made the whole thing much more complicated. The British consul in the Lion City was so anxious that he was pacing frantically in his office. If he had had a pedometer at the time, he would have taken at least 50,000 steps a day starting from the second day after the fleet lost contact. It wasn't until his subordinates reported that a huge fleet was approaching the port that he breathed a sigh of relief and immediately led his people to greet it. The atmosphere in the Lion City is more exaggerated. So over time British consul Rui also developed the habit of extravagance. Under an unprecedented grand welcome ceremony, the Austrian fleet slowly sailed into the harbour. This situation made Lieutenant General Raven Hobart clenched his fists, and the muscles on his face twitched and caused wounds, which made him cry out in pain. Chapter 494, Diverting Trouble to the East. After crossing the Strait of Malacca, Friedrich was also preparing to go to Chenla and Thailand, but was stopped by Lieutenant General Raven Hobart, who really couldn't stand the strolling, shopping style march of his Austrian counterpart. "Dear Grand Duke, we must first get to the bottom of the pirate incident, and then we can take care of other matters after the matter is completed." Lieutenant General Hobart and the head of the British investigation team, Billy Mullen Jr., were stunned at this time. The two of them actually believed the lies about a so-called powerful pirate group. This criminal team successively attacked the Dutch and British fleets, captured the port of Brunei, and even fought with the British troops who came for reinforcement. The fleets clashed. However, in fact, both Lieutenant General Xiun and the British consul Rui of the Lion City hope to make the so-called pirate leader the culprit of their own side scandal. Because they couldn't afford such a serious loss, they had to have a very powerful enemy to take the blame. Of course, France has prepared everything a long time ago. Although the situation has become a bit difficult to control now, there is still room for control in theory. After all, the ready-made scapegoat found was big and fat. The British were just seeking money in the Far East, so they would naturally be satisfied with the result. Kalimantan Island, Brunei Harbour is a dilapidated and desolate scene, and the huge wreckage in the bay is still vivid in my mind. This made the members of the British and Austrian investigation teams have different thoughts. The former hammered the railing on the deck, not expecting that the invincible Royal Navy would fall here. "No, this can't be done by ignorant indigenous people. Is it the army of the great powers? The Austrians? Impossible. They stopped and stopped along the way. How could it be so efficient? It must be that damn Gallic chicken. After their defeat in the Viceroyalty of La Plata, they went to Nanyang to retaliate, and heard that the French had established colonies in Vietnam before point. But why did they attack the Dutch fleet? Want to borrow the name of the British Empire? The British army has already begun to think wildly. On the other hand, Friedrich was extremely happy. He thought that Nanming was doomed at this time, but he did not expect to fight so beautifully and kill an entire British squadron. Once upon a time, Muhammad Ali, known as the Monster of Albania, spent 20 years of Egypt's national fortunes to defeat a British squadron. This situation in the Southern Ming dynasty was only established less than a few years ago. It seems that it really has unlimited potential. The Aborigines on the shore ran away as if they were dead as soon as they saw the figures of those western behemoths. By the time the British and Austrian warships approached, they had long since lost sight of them. So the two investigative teams decided to go ashore at the same time to look for clues. As soon as he landed, Friedrich stumbled over a large clue. When he got up, he suddenly discovered that it was a ball of braids. Braids. They must be king pirates, Friedrich said while the secretaries of the Austrian and British investigation teams began to take notes frantically. Lieutenant General Raven Hobbuck and Billy Mullen Jr. raised their foreheads at the same time. They felt that their teammates' IQ was really worrying. However, they soon found uniforms with the word soldier or brave printed on them in those abandoned houses, as well as some weapons such as swords and spears. Friedrich immediately wrote an article on the side claiming that he had discovered king pirate weapons, and the investigation team on the side was also busy writing. These two obvious evidences made the British very confused. But since seeing is believing, they cannot pretend not to have seen it, so they can only follow the general direction of their Austrian counterparts for the time being. But weren't the king people just defeated? Did they unilaterally tear up the armistice agreement? Lieutenant General Hobbuck and Mullen looked at each other and came to the conclusion that it was unlikely, and shouldn't there be a political power here? At this time, in the dense forest on the top of the mountain in the distance, Zhu Qiangying was observing everything happening in the port with a telescope, and the surrounding civil and military officials of Nanming were eager to try. Is he British? Someone asked impatiently. Not only. There are also Austrians. Xian's tone was a bit worried. Because of Zhu Qiangying's relationship, she still had a certain understanding of this mysterious western country. At the same time, because Nanming spices were exported to Zenla and then exchanged for weapons from the local area, she also learned that the so-called Zenla was just a puppet of Austria. But who would have thought that the puppet country actually defeated the South Vietnamese country to cede territory and pay compensation? You must know that they were barbarians that even the Qing dynasty could not conquer. However, at this time, the morale of Nanming was strong, and both civil and military officials wanted to fight another good battle. Zhu Qiangying herself also had this intention. She wanted to see what the upper limit of her own army was. If she could defeat all the western armies in one fell swoop, wouldn't she also be able to complete the great feats of the Yongle Emperor, including 5 expeditions to Mabi, Russia, 7 voyages to the Western Ocean, European continent, and 9 patrols of the North Sea, Nordic countries including Britain? It's just that the ideal is plump, but the reality is skinny. After some research, the British and Austrian sides decided to find the local government to find out the situation. After all, they could not just focus on physical evidence, but also look at witnesses, so they began to search for traces of local people. When Nanming saw those Westerners searching everywhere, they felt that the other party must be looking for them, so they hid in the deep mountains and old forests. The soldiers and civilians of Nanming were very confident in their concealment skills, and laid a large number of traps along the way. They did not believe that the group of foreigners outside could find them. In order to prevent smoke from rising and exposing traces, the soldiers and civilians of Nanming ate cold food and food left behind earlier. The civil servants and military generals were full of confidence at this time. They had completely defeated their fear of Europeans. After all, everyone was the same shit before they died. So what was the difference between them and the opium soldiers of the Qing dynasty? The combat effectiveness may be slightly higher, but Nanming claims to have an army of 300,000, and the number of Westerners on the beach is only a few thousand. But the warships look more impressive than before. Since there are a large number of informants in Malacca. Nanming has already deployed elite troops in this mountain. At the same time, there are previously dug tunnels in Malacca port point. As long as the group of Westerners separates, we can take action. When the center blooms and is surrounded on all sides, we will not be afraid that the other party will not surrender. Suddenly a huge shadow floated over, blocking the sun's rays. At this moment, all the soldiers and civilians of Nanming lost their ability to think. They didn't know how to describe the scene in front of them. Many people who are eating even forget to chew and let the food fall out of their mouths. Some soldiers' weapons fell to the ground, some simply sat on the ground, and those with weaker wills even began to kneel down to pray to gods and Buddhas. The sentry had actually seen the unknown object in the sky, but he was so stunned that he could only barely choke out a sentence. There are foreign monsters in the sky. ZHU. Kai Ying looked at the black and gold flag and thought of the scene when she first met Franz. The sense of oppression still made her breathless to this day, so she took 2 steps back and fell on the golden chair. However, compared with everyone present, her performance was pretty good. Other Nanming executives were frightened and speechless at this time. Even the old scholars who were accustomed to the big world looked at what was happening in front of them in a daze. And finally the knowledgeable Prime Minister Xian said, "It's the Kangming Lantern." Chapter 495, Diverting Trouble to the East. Amid the shocked sounds of Nanming's monarchs and ministers, 2 huge hot air balloons quietly floated over the Nanming army camp. Then an even more shocking scene happened. 2 people with big wings jumped out of the basket under the balloon, and then fluttered and slowly landed in the open space in the center of the camp. The next day, the Queen of Nanming went to Meraport in person to explain the whole story to Britain and Austria. That is, King pirates attacked the Dutch fleet and the British ports excessively, as the Queen of Nanming and the King of Brunei can testify. This conclusion is incredible. But the monarchs of the 2 countries personally testified, and the British could not say anything. And they also heard even more exciting news. That is, the so-called King pirates changed their name to the Guangzhou Navy after leaving, and even took away British warships. This made to senior British officials shout impossible. But the way to check the authenticity is also very simple. That is to go directly to the Qing dynasty to find this so-called Guangzhou Navy. As long as someone has stolen the goods and been appointed, no one can deny it. But this is an extremely serious diplomatic incident, even for Britain. A troublemaker forcibly breaking into another country's naval base to inspect military equipment is no different from declaring war. Billy Mullen Jr., the head of the British investigation team, felt that the matter was of great importance and needed to report it to Prime Minister Robert Peel and then apply for an investigation order from the Qing dynasty through diplomatic means. This is a normal process, but if you do this, it will take at least half a year to go back and forth. Whether it is selling stolen goods or modifying them, the other party can easily hide it from the investigation team. Vice Admiral Raven Hobbock advocated immediately leading the fleet to attack the Guangzhou naval station. He really didn't believe that those guys with pigtails could do anything to him. After all, this fleet is a branch of the North Sea Fleet. Its weapons, soldier quality, and even the command level of its generals are among the highest in the UK and even the world. When the 2 were arguing, they turned their attention to Archduke Friedrich, who quickly waved his hand and said, "We Austrians are not good at naval warfare, and now that the truth has been found out, my fleet has other missions to complete. At the same time, I have no authority to deploy troops privately without orders from my country, let alone participate in this kind of diplomatic dispute that may cause the friction." Billy Mullen Jr., the head of the British investigation team, let out a sigh of relief. He was afraid that this stupid Austrian young man would stimulate the stupid young man on his side to do something outrageous. This matter is too strange and involves too much. Prime Minister Robert Peel does not want the British Empire to fall into other crises. Even the main purpose of his visit this time is to appease the Austrians, but the development of events at this time has completely exceeded London's imagination, and such a huge loss is enough to knock out the entire cabinet. If you can't take immediate measures, I'm afraid your career will end here, but that's better than causing a diplomatic crisis and becoming a sinner in history. Just then Friedrich spoke again. "But I can give you a suggestion. Send someone to determine the authenticity of the incident first, and then take decisive action." "What do you mean?" Lieutenant General Raven Hobbuck and the head of the British investigation team, Billy Mullen Jr., said in unison, "What I mean is that there are ready-made candidates here who can gather information for you. Of course, I have no intention of covering up anyone. This is also to clear their suspicions. Am I right, Miss Zhu Kyung, Princess?" Sneaker scolded Friedrich. He remembered something and then changed his words. Her Majesty the Queen, Zhu. Kyung still remembered the shock before, when the Austrian messenger jumped from the huge cunning lantern and the note written by Franz himself, "Don't seek death," faced with the opponent's actions that were completely beyond her imagination. Zhu Kyung couldn't even think of any resistance point. She had seen the so-called flying over walls and climbing over walls in martial arts circles, but no one could survive a fall of more than 10 meters, let alone dozens of meters. In fact, what Zhu Kyung saw was only hot air balloons and Egon-assisted ornithopters. But these things were completely beyond the scope of knowledge of most people in the world at that time. Flying to the sky was still considered a human fantasy or even a miracle in Asia at this time, so the intensity of this shock was unimaginable. The so-called Egon-assisted flapping aircraft is based on an aircraft invented by Austrian Egon in 1808. He loved mechanical flight and built a human-powered ornithopter. This mechanical device can help people achieve short-term flight in the air. In fact, his descendants make a living by jumping from hot air balloons and performing flying performances. However, this thing is said to be an aircraft, but it is actually more like a hybrid of a hang glider and a parachute. In order to increase the success rate of this operation, Franz asked experts from the Royal Society of Science to modify it to increase safety and reliability. As for the operators, actors from the Deegan family are naturally used. After all, they have more experience, and as circus members, they prefer to take on such challenging tasks. In fact, Franz was not 100% sure of success, but even if the person who jumped fell to death, as long as the letter could be delivered, he could still scare him, right? Zhu Kyung was still very cooperative with Friedrich. She immediately said that Nanming could help investigate where the Guangzhou Navy hid those ships. Naturally, the British had no reason not to agree, and Nanming's actions were also very efficient. They quickly found out everything, and even drew a detailed defense map of the Guangzhou Navy. Of course, at this time, the Austrian Navy had already sailed to Chinla carrying spices from Kalimantan. As for why Zhu Kyung has this ability, of course it is because she sold those warships to the Guangzhou Navy under Franz's instruction. Coincidentally, after the Opium War, the strength of the Guangzhou Navy was severely damaged. Emperor Daoguang ordered the newly appointed Admiral Fan Zhentao to expand the navy and build a new type of warship equipped with broadside guns. Actually a barbarian ship. The Admiral, the new official, has been in charge of the job for a long time, so he naturally wants to create some momentum so that he can live up to the Emperor's favor. So he outsourced shipbuilding based on the principles of more, faster, better, and cheaper. In the end, after several hands-offs, the job actually fell into the hands of Nanming and the gang of traitors, something that the senior officials of the Qing dynasty would never have dreamed of. Of course, what they didn't expect even more was that it would trigger a huge wave. Although Lieutenant General Raven Hobbuck and the head of the British investigation team, Billy Mullen Jr., received assurances from Nanming, they were still skeptical. After all, Nanming and the Qing dynasty were in a hostile relationship. However, they had no good solution at this time. They could either verify it themselves, but this would involve a huge risk, or they could turn it into an unsolved case, but London would not believe that it was a pirate. In the end, these two people decided to take a gamble. After all, it was related to their own career, the rise and fall of their party, and more importantly, the dignity of the British Empire. So they broke into the Guangzhou Navy station and easily discovered the plundered Dutch, British, and Austrian warships. Chapter 496 Restless Europe. It will take at least several months before everything that happens in the Far East reaches Europe, thousands of miles away. Let us turn our attention back to Europe. The strike wave among British miners continues to ferment. Even if the mine owners imprison some of the troublemakers, it will not help. England is facing the biggest coal crisis since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In addition to coal workers, workers from other mines have also joined this massive demonstration point. This plunged the British economy, which had just improved, into a cold winter again, and even had to purchase coal from Scotland. However, the cost of doing so is extremely uneconomical. Although the price of coal is cheap, the freight is horribly high. Coupled with England's alarming consumption, the whole situation looks very funny. Almost all British newspapers criticised the Sots overwhelmingly. They believed that this was a complete traitorous act, a sign of ignorance and low intelligence, and that they were followers of Mammon and Belphegor. Mammon and Belphegor are the embodiments of greed and laziness in the Bible. However, there were people on the European continent who waved and cheered for them, and even called on people to donate money and materials. Then the two great men received an incredible amount of donations. It's just that the source of this fund is puzzling to them, but it is true that the two of them are very poor. This money is enough for the two of them to live comfortably for the rest of their lives, and even their children and grandchildren will no longer need to work. But the reason why great men can become great men is that they are different from ordinary people. The two resisted the temptation and still started to assist the British miners. So, when the miners were driven to the streets by the mine owners, a sum of aid fund solved their urgent needs. This group of miners actually had nothing, because their houses were built on the land of the mine owners and were deemed by the government to be mine property. The residents were evicted from their houses. This move resulted in tens of thousands of people being forced to leave their homes, and the methods of the mine thugs were even more heinous. Whether they were the elderly, children, or pregnant women, they were all driven out with extremely violent methods. Some mothers were even dragged out of bed by their hair and pushed into dirty, smelly ditches. It was clear that this inhumane act was directed by someone whose purpose was to cause a riot and turn the strike into an atrocity, so that they could forcibly disperse the participants. In view of the strong influence of the Chartists at this moment, Whitehall did not dare to easily announce the termination of the strike, so it had to resort to this strategy. After all, the number of miners was much smaller than that of the Chartists, and they were also located in relatively remote areas. If it were placed in London, they would never have the courage. Thanks to donations from the European continent, the miners who participated in the strike lived much better than in history. At least there were no large-scale deaths from freezing and starvation. But this situation did not last long, because there was no lower limit for certain groups, and soon this country that advocated free trade banned merchants from selling goods to miners at the same time. Hungry people were recruited from Ireland and Wales to replace them. The restoration of involution was the real drain on this group of warriors who dared to challenge serious injustice. However, some previously suppressed news also broke out at this time, such as the use of child labor in some mining areas, and resulting in widespread deaths. Of course, the boss must not know about this scandal, and it must be the temporary supervisor below who is doing it for petty profits as a result. A group of unlucky guys who blatantly violated the law and caused major accidents were sent to the gallows as for ignorant child laborers such as David, Jim and Kate. They will be exempted from prosecution and will be sent back to their homes or to workhouses and workhouses for the poor. Since Russia in the Near East joined Austria's trading system, the Tsar's wallet has bulged. The first thing Nicholas I thought of when he got money was to engage in military industry. Before, there was only one Ivresk arsenal in Russia, which was established during the reign of his brother Alexander I to deal with Napoleon. Due to a long-term lack of funds and backward technology, the annual output only stayed at the level of 25,000 rifles, 5,000 swords, 200,000 rounds of ammunition, and 30 cannons at the same time. The production capacity of the British Enfield arsenal was almost double that of its Russian counterpart, and there were 3 other arms factories of the same level in Great Britain, including a Calcutta arsenal in India. Similarly, Russia's production capacity is not as good as France and Austria, not even as good as Prussia, and only slightly stronger than Spain, the sick man of Western Europe. However, with the support of its ally France, the former master of Iberia is increasing its military production capacity by leaps and bounds. This made Nicholas I unable to sit still, so he spent huge sums of money to establish 2 arsenals, namely the Shettroretsk arsenal and the Tula arsenal. Street Petersburg is very cautious when it comes to the military industry, so all arsenals are built in its hinterland point. Although the production capacity of Russia's arsenal is weak, the state control is strong, while the arsenals of France and Prussia have strong private enterprise backgrounds. And in Austria, the presence of France has led to a split between public and private. The British Enfield arsenal is also known as the Royal Small Arms Arsenal. Historically, British weapons have represented the highest level in the world, but now they lag behind Austria and Prussia. The sharp increase in production capacity caused by the Tsar's massive military industry is something worthy of praise in itself, but the cost is also a huge point. For this reason, the Russians came up with the idea of friendly neighbors to the Ottomans. After all, a Tsar's life would be incomplete without engaging in several Russian-Turkish wars. The evaluation of a Tsar by later generations often depends on how many Russian-Turkish wars he launched. Nicholas I naturally knew this, so a serf living on the Russian-Turkish border complained. The sheep raised by the Ottomans crossed the border again, but this time they were not eating cabbage, but cotton. This immediately attracted great attention from the Tsarist Russian government. After all, it was an imperial system. As long as His Majesty the Great Tsar felt it was important, then small things would become big things. Some ministers proposed setting up isolation zones, some proposed sending troops to the border for training, and others proposed raising more shepherd dogs for biological control. Naturally, these weird things could not please His Majesty the Tsar, and instead made him almost angry to death. I can't see Russia's future with these idiots, Nicholas. I turned his head to Prince Mainkov and Duke Liubei, and they immediately began to think hard. The Tsar raised his forehead again. Damn idiot. Do you have to make me drive animals like me before you can take the initiative to think? Alexander Nikolaevich, tell me what you think. However, at this time, the Russian crown prince was still staring at the new court lady in the corner and did not hear his father's question. Grand Duke Konstantin Nikolaevich, Alexander's younger brother, on the side, quickly tapped his brother twice with his elbows. At this time, Alexander looked at his father, who was glaring at him in confusion. Nicholas I was speechless for his young child, but since the crown prince had to maintain his majesty in public, it was not easy for him to go into details, so he could only ask other people present, does anyone have any other comments? At this time, a young officer stood up. Since the Ottomans can't control the livestock on their land, they should hand over the land to us for management. But our Russian Empire is a civilized country. We can first send envoys to Constantinople to ask for compensation. Depending on the other party's reaction and the international situation will be decided again. This answer made Nicholas I very satisfied and asked with a smile, young man, what is your name? Your Majesty, my name is Andrei Uvarov. Chapter 497 Crisis surrounded Russia, St. Petersburg. Nicholas I was obsessed with everything about the army, so 10 of his 13 most important ministers were from military backgrounds. An outstanding young man looked more energetic under the straight military uniform, which made His Majesty the Tsar extremely happy. However, the surname Uvarov still brought back some not so good memories of this iron-fisted monarch. The old Duke Uvarov was a favorite of the late Emperor Alexander I. However, this person chose to support Constantine, the brother of Nicholas I, during the Decembrist rebellion. Although he did not directly participate in the rebellion, it is impossible for such a person to gain the trust of the Tsar again. As a result, this family with a glorious resume was driven out of St. Petersburg. In fact, Nicholas I has always been worried about being forced into the palace, but fortunately he is in a good mood now. And the Tsar was particularly open-minded in some respects. That is, he rarely took his anger out on other people's family members. Andrei, you said it very well. So are you willing to serve the Russian Empire? I need someone with both smart and brave qualities to visit the Ottoman Empire to release my goodwill. Being entrusted with an important task by the Tsar is a supreme honor for a young nobleman. Although Andrei Uvarov's character is relatively aloof and cold, he can't hide the joy in his heart at this moment. I am willing to serve His Majesty. It is an honor to serve the Russian Empire. In the eyes of Nicholas I, 205 centimeters, the young man in front of him was of medium height, 186 centimeters, with a handsome and cold appearance, resolute but not rigid. The dark green military uniform of a Russian officer fit perfectly on him, but his rank of major was a bit low. In fact, if Andrei Uvarov was not the eldest son of the Duke's family, then he would at most be a lieutenant at this time. Okay, this is how young people should be. I will promote you to Major General now. General Key and Mainkov will go to the Ottoman Empire together, remember. Don't forget what you said. I'm waiting for your good news. Yes. His Majesty the Tsar ruler. Andrei Uvarov usually disdains shouting such slogans, but at this time, he found that he could also shout it so smoothly. London, 10 Downing Street. Robert Peel slammed the information in his hand on the table. He could not believe that the aid to the miners was actually coming from Prussia, and that these people were a dangerous element. At this time, the Prime Minister even suspected that the Prussians were planning some shocking conspiracy. After all, their finance minister Friedrich List had just visited not long ago, hoping to smuggle British goods it is said to be smuggling, but in fact it is a monopoly. After all, the German customs union is now filled with Austrian products, and Prussia's industrial base is too backward, and it seems that it is a complete fantasy to catch up and surpass it. But this Mr. Lister is a ruthless person who doesn't take the usual path. He understands that the primitive accumulation of capital is bloody, either letting others bleed or letting himself bleed. So, now that you know this truth, how should you act? It's very simple. Austrian goods can sweep through Central Europe, but can they deal with Great Britain, the world's number one? He has personally visited the United Kingdom and Austria, and naturally knows that the citizens of the former are obviously harder working, while the people of the latter spend more energy on internal fighting and consumption. Of course, it is precisely because Austrians like to spend money that the German customs union has not been hollowed out by them. Therefore, Friedrich List's strategy of saving the country through curves made Frederick William IV's heart move. After thinking about it, Robert Peel even wanted to take action, but the fact that the Prussians had played a role in the previous miners' strike made him confused. Now the United Kingdom's civil war around the world is too long, and all aspects at home and abroad are affecting the energy of the chief minister. The white hair is the ironclad proof. He deeply felt that the 3,000 civil servants system that made the British proud was no longer able to meet the growing needs of the empire. The large number of temporary workers and outsourced personnel has greatly reduced administrative efficiency and also brought a lot of waste and corruption. But if he wanted to change this system and involve high-level interests, he could only feel comfortable in his mind. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz was also troubled by domestic corruption. Because Friedrich led his fleet to Asia and Africa, and was busy quelling chaos in Africa, the number of escort ships required for normal trade was insufficient. The mysterious disappearance of a gold transport ship from Mexico to Austria made Franz feel a little pity at first. After all, encountering various disasters at sea and even pirates may lead to such results. But soon information came that an Austrian gold transport ship was discovered in Boston Harbor in the United States. Tens of millions of florins disappeared, and more importantly, detailed information about the Austrian side was revealed to the United States. This makes future activities of the empire on the Atlantic extremely unsafe. At the same time, because Tazanana talks about the Emancipation Proclamation all day long, and actually does it until the Americans do it hundreds of years later, this incident led to frequent mass escapes of black slaves in the American South and the French Texas colony. Tazanana's blackguards have also grown from the original 2,000 to more than 8,000. This includes the number of people lost in the Civil War. Otherwise the total number would have exceeded 10,000. The Black Legion played an important role in the Mexican Civil War, and its leader Diego became the first black general in Mexican history. However, giving blacks and whites the same rights aroused dissatisfaction among the people and the opposition, and even angered slave owners in the South and Texas. The relationship between Mexico and the French Texas colony was already very poor. At this time, Washington received news about large gold mines. I'm afraid that a war is inevitable. In fact, since Gizzard arrived in Texas, he has filled up the local tax revenue, causing farmers and factory owners to complain. However, the gap between the American cowboys and the French regular army is not generally large. The latter only needs 1/3 of the former's troops to win the battle. If the two have equal strength, it will be a complete massacre point. So these Americans could only pay taxes to Gizit honestly, but these guys also made a request. That is, the problem of slave loss must be solved. Therefore, on the one hand, the former French minister and the newly appointed governor of Texas continued to purchase slaves from Dutch and Portuguese merchants, and on the other hand, he asked his subordinates to pay more attention to the increase in slave escapes. In fact, he also understood that there could never be real peace between Texas, Mexico, and the United States, so he took it for granted that the Emancipation Proclamation was a Mexican conspiracy against France. For this reason, Gizit found many French literary figures and legal experts to refute the declaration, but they all failed. After all, France itself admitted that the slave trade was neither humane nor legal. Washington, White House John Tyler repeatedly weighed the pros and cons of going to war with Mexico, and finally wrote a personal letter to King Louis Philippe of France. Chapter 498 Silesia, Prussia, Silesia. In the city of Katowice, in the house of Master Philpot, a little boy suddenly fainted. Bengt Jung, who was sitting in the room inspecting the goods, didn't even raise his head. He just let out a disdainful snort, as if he had long been used to it. Most of the weavers watched all this happening numbly. They had been tortured by the slave life day after day and were lifeless. It seemed that they could not even move their eyes in the end. It was only because of the constant shouting and begging of several young female weavers who couldn't bear it any longer that the wooden men in the room invited the doctor out. Dels is Mr. Philpot's personal doctor. As soon as he entered the room, he covered his mouth and nose with a handkerchief. The sour smell in the air made him feel sick, and he wished he could immediately return to the warmth and smell of roses in the arms of Doctor. Dels looked at the boy on the ground with disgust, and said without thinking, "I'm so hungry, but you haven't checked yet? How can you draw conclusions so easily?" a young female worker asked with some confusion. Doctor. Dels suddenly turned his head and glanced at the female worker like a knife. "A doctor's hands are extremely noble. Do you want me to touch this dirty garbage?" Although Dr. Dels's words made no sense, they were so domineering that they shocked everyone in the room. Some even thought that the young female worker had offended the doctor. After Dr. Dels left, several elderly weavers and women began to talk. "There are always people fainting from hunger lately. There's nothing we can do about it. Wages are always being cut, and food prices are rising all the time. It's really hard to live. Yes, I heard that the potato harvest failed again this year. How can people live like this? It's strange. There are no natural disasters this year. What's wrong? You don't even know this? Those inhumane guys would rather grow for animals to eat than for people to eat. We are worse than those animals. Oh, maybe we will all be like that child. Why is this? I have tried my best to survive, and I have never done anything immoral. Why doesn't God look at me?" At this time, Bengt Jung couldn't stand listening anymore, and said with a cold snort, "You lazy guys, it's not easy to see God. You can go to the master to get a rope, and then go home and hang yourself like the Avra family. If God doesn't care about you lazy fools, then no one will know." It was impossible for the local factory owners to let the weavers know that the Avra family was a typical negative example of immigrants to Austria, so this story had another version in Prussia. That is, the Austrians also turned them away, and then Effa and his lame husband had to commit suicide, while their children became beggars in Vienna, after being tortured by unscrupulous priests. The weavers present could only look at each other in shock. Then a young weaver spoke to comfort him. "If you are hungry, pray to God. If that still doesn't work, pick up a stone from the ground and hold it in your mouth, as if it is a piece of candy that you can never finish. This is the method my mother told me." You are right. Isn't that right? After all, only when people are alive can they enjoy the hardships. I don't know if that's right, but I do know how your mother died. It turned out that she was choked to death. Another weaver laughed, and the whole room was filled with lively atmosphere. At night, the forest officer fell asleep listening to the barking of dogs and the screams of children and women in the forest. After all, these people couldn't make any money at all. It would be better to feed his own dogs and train others to waste time with them. Ferocious. After all, they still make money in the dog fighting ring. Point 2 Forest rangers sat on the hillside holding guns and watching the chasing game in the forest. Their mission was to protect, but not to protect the children who went to the forest to collect firewood secretly from being bitten to death by vicious dogs. On the contrary, their duty is to ensure that these people do not jump over the wall in order to avoid hurting the forest officer's beloved dogs. After all, there was a time when a little boy blinded a pit bull in order to protect his sister. Although the guy paid the same price afterwards, this made the forest officer very angry. Point you must know that the price of each fighting dog is more than 500 thalers, and their appetite is astonishing. They eat 3 to 4 kilograms of fresh meat every day. Point these rangers definitely cannot afford this kind of cost. If they have so much money, they will definitely. Just when the two rangers were still immersed in their own fantasies, suddenly the fighting dog that had been chasing the prey excitedly just now let out a miserable cry. Point a sharpened wooden stake passed through the body of the fighting dog. As it continued to struggle, its life was rapidly drained away. Point the little girl who had been screaming and running away picked up a heavy wooden stick and hit the pitbull on the head hard. Point after a few strokes, the pitbull's legs straightened up. She quickly took the bag from her body and put the dead dog into it. Then she took a few pieces of firewood and disappeared into the woods. Due to the lack of proper maintenance of the forest land, resulting in overgrown weeds, the two rangers quickly lost track of their target. Point the next day, the one-eyed boy smelled the aroma. As soon as he got up, point it turned out that his sister had already prepared a large pot of soup with unknown ingredients. The boy and his sister had been dependent on each other for 2 years, especially after he lost his left eye. He almost relied on his sister to support the whole family. Good morning, Ace. Seeing her brother get up, her sister cheered up, but she couldn't hide her tiredness. Good morning, Ruby. The boy named Ace stroked his sister's long hair and found that there were a few more bloodstains on her hands and her clothes were even more tattered. Eat quickly, this pot of soup is delicious, Ruby advised with some pride. What's in this? It can't be frogs and snakes, right? Ace joked. In Europe, frogs and snakes are actually symbols of witches. Plus, with the big dirty pot in front of him, its intention is naturally not the same. It goes without saying, HMPH, don't eat if you're afraid of death. You'll starve to death. Ruby scooped a large bowl for herself, then took out 2 rye breads and ate them in big gulps. Alkaline bread? Why are you eating so extravagantly today? Ace asked curiously. After all, he works as a weaver at home every day and his income is only enough to buy some rotten potatoes. But today there is meat in the soup, and it is strange to eat bread with alkaline water. That nobleman had a great harvest yesterday and was in a good mood to reward me, couldn't he? In fact, in order to support her family, Ruby went to the hunting ground every day to apply for a job as a hound. Most of the hunting grounds in Prussia are swampy wetlands, so retrieving prey usually requires hunting dogs. However, ordinary hounds will lose their identity as owners, while excellent hounds are often very expensive and require a lot of patience to cultivate. Therefore, ordinary small nobles and businessmen did not use hounds, but hired hunting boys. These children would pick up the prey shot by their owners. Like hounds, and these kids are smarter and cheaper than dogs. There is also a small wooden sign in Ruby and Ace's home with the words "I run fast and I'm not afraid of death" written in chalk. As for the rye bread and the pickled cabbage in the soup, it was one of Ruby's gains last night. In fact, when the two rangers chased her, Ruby did not run away in a straight line, but made a half circle and stole the ranger's home. These rye bread and pickled cabbage were her spoils. In addition, there were 2 bottles of low quality wine, but Ruby planned to use them for disinfection or bribe others to use them. Chapter 499 Drunk Talk. After enjoying the delicious soup and rye bread, Ace began his day's work. As a weaver, he had to work 16 hours a day. Even with this year-round work, he could not earn 120 florins a year, and because Austria had greatly improved the efficiency of machinery, the price of cloth fell again and again. Therefore, the wages of weavers were also suppressed again and again. By 1844, they were less than 60 florins. At the same time, coupled with the fact that the gold shipped from the Americas was diluted by France with all of Germany, although it did not cause social unrest, it was certain that prices would rise to a certain extent. All this has exacerbated the suffering of these people, and the Weavers Group has become synonymous with laziness and theft under the propaganda of some people. In a tavern, Mr. Philpott was drinking wine and confiding his depression to the forest officer, accompanied by the tavern owner's beautiful daughter. Damn it, you know, those lazy guys made me lose money. Damn it, why is one of your dogs missing? You also made me lose money, do you know? In fact, Forrester Wilgang and Mr. Philpott were friends, but the former also lost money, so he looked very unhappy. The beautiful girl on the side, who was born in the tavern, can naturally see all this and hurriedly advises, "Gee, Lang, you've drunk too much, can I go with you to rest, master?" Philpott slapped the beautiful girl on the cheek, and the latter's face suddenly swelled up. "Who are you? How dare you call me G Lang? You are a free bitch. Do you think that you are mine if you sleep with me? I have slept with too many women. Get out." "I was wrong. Please forgive me," the girl begged, and was still making her last attempt, but Mr. Philpott didn't show mercy and kicked her away. The girl could only cry and ran out, but was stopped by a merchandise salesman who had admired her for a long time. "If you don't mind, let's have a drink together." The girl nodded, thinking it would be nice to have a spare tire. However, the two of them hadn't even had a few words to chat before the salesman drank a few glasses of wine and the topic turned to the Weavers again. "I'm curious about these guys who always say they have no money and no food. But look at the funerals after those guys die. It's so grand. There's an orchestra, and there are so many priests here. I don't know what you think. It's the funeral of William IV. The girl with some redness and swelling on her face thought seriously. What these people did was a bit excessive, but maybe it was out of respect for the deceased. I know of a country where when people die, their relatives will hold a grand funeral for them. Even if they have no money, they will do so. Even if they are in debt. Although I appreciate everything these people do for their deceased relatives, I also feel that it is a bit bad. After all, life is already very hard. Still spending so much money on dead people and even going into debt. So what should the living do? I felt it necessary to talk to their parish priest about this. The girl's White Lotus speech attracted the salesman opposite to say yes. The drinker on the side sneered. "No wonder you can't sell your products and can only drink here. No wonder this girl gets beaten for cheating." "What do you mean?" the two said in unison. "I tell you, the parish priest is the culprit. You all know that funerals need to be conducted by priests, but have you ever thought about where the priest's money comes from? That's right, it's a funeral. The grander the funeral, the more the priests earn." After saying that, he ignored the two people who looked at each other, and the drinker left the tavern. Downstairs is the place where the untouchables live, and a few people are talking about the strange things that have happened recently. Yesterday, a weaver was beaten to death by rangers who burst into his home. I know, it's old Pete. He's a good man. He has no children. He spends all his time spinning and weaving, and he never gets sick. Didn't you say he was mentally ill? Nonsense. He is crazy. And can he still knit something every day? Fart. You're not crazy. Who can knit things every day? Drink. Several people toasted together. Why should you shoot him? It is said that he stole the wood from the Baron's forest and injured the dog. It's no wonder he is a thief after all. But this is too harsh. Shooting just for a few pieces of firewood. You can't say that. If everyone steals, wouldn't the world be in chaos? If you can afford it, who would steal it? Now we weavers can't get enough of it. Hey, the dam broke again. My house and fields were destroyed. Now I have to work non-stop every day, otherwise the bank will take away my land and house. Why is this dam repaired every year and bursting every year? Nonsense. Are they building a dam? I saw with my own eyes that they built a swimming pool for the Earl's house. Fart. How will they make money if they don't fix it? Drink. Several people toasted again. By the way, why didn't the Austrian dam burst? You haven't noticed that all the people living under the dam are local officials and their relatives? There is no need for the central government to send people to inspect every year. those people start moving on their own. Look at our Prussian adults. When they come, they stay in the most luxurious hotels with a few lovers, find a few prostitutes for their honeymoon, and then go back to Berlin. A farmer who was drinking at a nearby table said this when he saw the group of self-pitying weavers feeling very irritated. Is it useful for you guys to complain here? This is all destined by God. We must accept reality. When life is not going as you want, you always blame others, believing that you are too useless. What are you doing when the year is good? Don't just eat, drink, whore, and gamble. If you worked hard to save some money at that time, you can use it to save money when you are in trouble now. There is no need to steal wood and be chased away by dogs. The weavers at the other table were not to be outdone. Farmers are farmers. Even if they do nothing, the wheat in the fields will sprout. They can go to bed early and get up late every day, just like noble gentlemen. Yes, yes, the other weaver responded. These gentlemen will find a shed to rent to a weaver who has no place to live, and then charge a high rent and use him as a slave. If the latter dares to say no, the consequences can be imagined. Farmer, they are all a bunch of snobs, and they will talk to whoever is stronger. In fact, the life of Prussian farmers in this era was indeed pretty good. Point after all, there are tariffs between Austria and Hungary, so the former often imports large quantities of grains, feed and other crops from the latter, which in turn increases farmers' income. Point in the past, Silesian weavers were indeed superior to others, and there were cases where weavers looked down on farmers, so the two sides have looked down on each other for a long time. Point, but that goes back to before this as time. What are you talking about? You useless trash. Can you use a plow to pull a ditch? Yes. You might pull a twisted ditch and get your ass kicked by your own donkey. Will the wheat be bundled and thrown into the carriage? You are just a bunch of trash. You know nothing, yet you have the nerve to complain here, said the farmer angrily. Point, his views represented the social attitude towards weavers at that time. Mr. Philpott upstairs even whistled for his wonderful speech. Chapter 500, Eat It All and Wipe It Clean. Franz naturally knew what was happening in Silesia, but there was not much he could do. It can be said that the reasons for poverty in Silesia include, but are not limited to, backward production methods and systems, traditional concepts, technology, national policies, natural and man-made disasters result of joint action. Point, the first is the tax collector system that has continued since the time of Frederick the Great. Secondly, it is inevitable that the cottage industry will be impacted by modern industry. Technological innovations and mechanical inventions have exacerbated today's predicament. Point, at the same time, Berlin demanded too much from Silesia, but subsidized it too little, and even deliberately restricted its development. Point, this is not only because this land was taken from Austria, but also because there are a large number of Poles living on it. Point, according to contemporary estimates, the Prussian government took at least more than 1 billion francs in money and supplies from Silesia in the first 50 years of the 19th century. Point, this number is very terrible, equivalent to this small province paying the equivalent of half Hungary in taxes every year. Then there were natural disasters that caused harvest failures in parts of Prussia, but only Silesia had the highest number of people starving to death. Among them, there were 2,000 people in 1841, 3,000 people in 1842, and 6,000 people in 1843. In 1844, the harvest failed again. Point, among them, the Prussian government and local nobles have always played the role of villains. The gentlemen concealed the actual local situation, while the inspectors sent by Berlin's top leaders neglected their duties and hastily submitted reports to the superiors without investigation. Point, the relief work was also very ridiculous, and the famine in Silesia after 1838 finally could not be concealed. The government allocated money to local nobles, who used it directly to grow feed, causing grain prices to rise further later. He also sent seeds, clothes, and paper to the people affected by the disaster. You must know that the weavers at that time were almost uneducated and had no pens in their hands. Paper could only be used for wiping butts and was considered too hard. Point, by the way, toilet paper in the modern sense only became popular in 1857. At this time, Europe had all kinds of strange tools after using the toilet, and one of the most outrageous ones was probably the gooseneck point. Yes, those kings would wipe their butts with the swan's neck, which was said to give the buttocks an extraordinary pleasure. Using it to make toilet paper has the softness of down and the warmth of a goose. This warmth will pass through the large and small intestines and reach the brain and heart. John Harrington, minister of the time of Elizabeth I. After Franz learned this story, he could no longer look directly at the word swan neck point. Back to the topic. Tens of thousands of weavers were affected by the disaster in 1843. As a result, the local government only sent 146 kilograms of frozen rotten potatoes, causing thousands of people to starve to death. One thing that was better about Silesia at this time than in history was that Austria was in the German customs union, and Franz vigorously promoted immigration policies, so more than half of the people who should have starved to death went to Austria. Compared with the future prince, there were others who paid more attention to the trends in the Prussian textile industry center at this time, namely British Prime Minister Robert Peel and the current leader of the Polish Restoration Army, Landry Promy. The reason why the former pays attention to this point is very simple, that is, to avenge the miners' strike. After all, Europa is still in a peaceful period at this time. Before everyone breaks up, they can only make small moves behind the scenes. However, now that they had the experience of dealing with the French, they were already familiar with dealing with the Prussians. Coupled with Hanover's ambiguous attitude, this made the British action more effective, and soon a large amount of weapons and ammunition flowed into Silesia area. At the same time, the spies they sent also began to incite the weavers to riot. But it was soon discovered that those people on the verge of bankruptcy did not even need a single spark. The weavers who could not afford to eat and survive were already a volcano waiting to erupt at any time, and the local Prussian government obviously did not prepare a response. But there is only one small problem, that is, the number of weavers is too small and is on a downward trend. At this time, there are only more than 30,000 people. Even if they can all be organized, they may not have much impact on the Kingdom of Prussia. Moreover, most of these people are children, women, and the elderly, and 2/3 of them have varying degrees of physical deformity. Almost all of them have lung diseases, and their fighting and destructive capabilities are very limited. At the same time, because they belong to many lords and are far apart from each other, it is difficult to organize. The Polish Restoration Army's focus on Silesia was naturally due to London's contribution. Although the Anglo-French alliance was not formed, Poland successfully connected with the British line. From the perspective of Great Britain, the more chaotic Europe is, the happier it is, and Poland is undoubtedly the most suitable troublemaker at this time. However, in the eyes of Landry Promy, the value of Silesian weavers was limited. They could not donate money or materials to the Polish nationalist army, and they also lacked a lofty ideal of reviving Poland. Moreover, Poland's restoration movement was at a low ebb at this time, and it was obviously not a wise choice to offend Prussia. As for the promises made by Britain and France, he could not see any sincerity. As a result, Landry Promy did not intend to wade into the muddy waters of the Weavers' Rebellion, and he spent more of his energy on supporting local pro-Polish forces at this time. The Berlin court was unaware of what was brewing in Silesia, and Wilhelm IV was still waiting for news of the victorious return of his finance minister, Friedrich List. After all, monopolizing the distribution rights of British goods and saving the country through curves is not a bad idea. At that time, the German region had a fascination for English goods, while French goods were synonymous with luxury. Austrian products are cheap industrial products, while local products are synonymous with fake ones. Historically, German industry started by imitating, but it soon formed its own characteristics. But this process is obviously much slower at this time, because the market is full of Austrian industrial products. Austrian products are good and cheap, so the profits from counterfeiting are not high, and imitation is also very difficult. What is even more worrying is that this country has the ability to enforce transnational laws, but it's a good thing for the nobles and the people. After all, who doesn't want to buy the best goods at the least cost? But from a country's perspective, this is not a good thing. It means that they have to rely on Austria's production capacity point. If there is a conflict between the two countries, we will be in a very disadvantageous position. However, the game and competition in trade have little impact on small countries. After all, they themselves are inherently deficient and have long been accustomed to this kind of life of judging people's faces. But for powerful countries such as Prussia and Bavaria, it is very painful and dangerous. However, most of the German princes did not have much objection to Austria's possible control of the German customs union and even the entire German Confederation. After all, it was only about 50 years before the end of the Holy Roman Empire. But Prussia is different. It is too big, and its past grievances with Austria have caused it to find ways to check and balance its southern neighbor. At this time, Friedrich List received a cold reception in London, which puzzled him. Because no matter how you look at it, the alliance between Britain and Prussia is a more favorable situation for the former. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.